Welcome, wanderer, to a different kind of descent, wanderers. Tonight, we do not walk the wasteland haunting beauty. We go beneath the universe, into the sealed space cities, where the Vault-Tec Corporation conducted the research programs that the cheerful promotional material through these never described, and that the people who sealed themselves inside the vaults on October the eerie calm 23rd, 2077 never consented to participate in. The vaults were not shelters, they were laboratories. The people inside them were not survivors protected by a caring institution. They were subjects selected for research. Tonight we examine what that means specifically, completely, honestly. Settle in. Let the vault door seal behind you. Let us begin. The Vault-Tec Corporation understood something about fear that the pre-war American advertising industry had been developing the vocabulary for across the full span of the 20th century, which was the understanding that fear, properly managed and properly directed, was not an obstacle to the sale of a product, but its most reliable engine that a population sufficiently frightened of a sufficiently specific threat would extend to the institutional actor, promising protection from that threat, a quality of trust and a depth of purchasing commitment that no amount of positive promotional messaging could reliably produce. The resource wars had been providing the fear. The nuclear anxiety that had been a background condition of American civilian life since the first bombs had been used against Japan had, across the decades of the resource wars and the progressive deterioration of the geopolitical situation that the resource wars documented, accumulated from background condition into foreground preoccupation, from the specific low-grade awareness that the world contained weapons capable of ending civilization into the specific acute awareness that the world contained powers with specific motivations for deploying those weapons against the specific country in which the person with the awareness was living. Vault-Tec had not created this fear. It had recognized it, assessed its commercial and contractual utility, and organized its entire institutional identity around the specific promise of protection from the specific threat that the fear was organized around the promise that the corporation had developed. Through the specific combination of proprietary technology and government partnership and the particular institutional confidence of a large defense contractor operating in the specific regulatory environment of the pre-war period, the means to protect the American civilian population from the nuclear exchange that the geopolitical situation was making increasingly likely. The Pip-Boy mascot is the franchise's most efficient compression of everything the Vault-Tec brand was trying to communicate to the civilian population. It was marketing to the specific combination of cheerfulness, technological confidence, and the particular quality of institutional warmth that the brand had developed as the emotional register within which all of its public communications operated. The Pip-Boy's round face and permanent smile, and the specific aesthetic of mid-century American optimism that the character embodied, communicated something precise about what the Vault-Tec brand understood relationship to the civilian population to be, which was the relationship of a benevolent technological institution, providing the specific care that the specific conditions of the pre-war world required caring institutions to provide. The character appeared on promotional materials and on the Pip-Boy devices that Vault residents would carry, and on the specific signage that decorated the Vault's interiors present everywhere within the designed environment, as the specific visual reminder of the institutional identity that had constructed that environment, and that the environment's inhabitants were embedded within. The cheerfulness was not incidental. It was the specific emotional content that the brand had determined was most effective for the specific marketing challenge it was addressing, which was the challenge of selling an underground bunker, of making the specific idea of spending an indefinite period sealed beneath the Earth's surface in a confined space with a limited population feel not like the specific dystopian scenario that any honest description would have produced, but like the specific expression of institutional care and technological achievement that the brand needed it to feel like. in order to generate the consumer response it required. The promotional films that Vault-Tec produced and distributed across the pre-war media landscape are among the franchise's most carefully constructed illustrations of the specific gap between institutional presentation and institutional reality. Short cinematic pieces whose visual language drew directly from the specific aesthetic of mid-century American educational and promotional films, whose cheerful narration and carefully composed imagery of happy families moving into spacious and well-appointed vault environments communicated a specific version of what the vault experience would consist of, that the institutional records of what the vault experience actually consisted of contradict at almost every point. The families in the promotional films smiled. The vault interiors in the promotional films were warm and well lit and organized around the specific domestic comfort of the mid-century American home transposed underground. The overseers in the promotional films were benevolent authority figures whose institutional role was the protection and the guidance of the community in their care. The promotional films were not simply optimistic, they were specifically, precisely, and deliberately constructed to produce in the viewer the understanding that what the Vault program offered was exactly what it presented itself as offering, which was the specific protection of the viewer's family in the specific conditions of the nuclear exchange that the geopolitical situation was making increasingly probable. The application process was the specific mechanism through which the Vault-Tec Corporation converted the civilian population's fear into the specific relationship of institutional dependency that the program required its subject population to be in before the vault doors sealed. The waiting lists were real. The competition for spots in the vault program was real, driven by the specific combination of the program's deliberately limited capacity relative to the civilian population seeking protection within it, and the progressive intensification of the geopolitical anxiety that made the program's intenses protection feel increasingly urgent to the people seeking it. The application involved the submission of specific, personal, and professional information, the documentation of skills and health status and family composition that the program's designers required for the specific, logistical purposes of managing a vault population's composition, and that also served the specific research purposes of providing the program's experimental designers with the baseline population data that the experimental protocols required. The people who applied for vault spots were doing the specific thing that rational actors do in conditions of genuine existential threat. They were seeking the best available protection from a threat that the institutional landscape of the pre-war world had not provided any other plausible mechanism for addressing. They were trusting the institution that had presented itself as capable of providing what they needed. The trust was the specific vulnerability that the program's design had been constructed to exploit. The waiting list position was a source of genuine anxiety in the pre-war civilian population, a specific social pressure point whose existence the franchise has documented across its terminal records and holotapes, with the specific texture of a status marker that the pre-war world had not previously possessed, the status of having or not having secured a place in an institutional framework whose specific promise was survival itself. The conversations between pre-war characters whose audio recordings the franchise preserves establish the specific quality of a social environment in which vault spot allocation had become a primary organizing concern of civilian life. In the period before the bombs, a concern whose specific social dynamics replicated in the specific conditions of nuclear anxiety, the dynamics of any scarce resource whose distribution determined life outcomes in societies organized around institutional access. People leveraged professional connections. They sought information about which vaults had remaining capacity. They assessed the specific trade-offs between different available vault programs with the specific seriousness of decisions understood to be among the most consequential available. The corporation had created, through the specific combination of genuine scarcity and genuine threat, and the particular institutional authority of the only available protective option, the specific social conditions in which the question of whether to seek a vault spot was not meaningfully available to most people who had the option in which the only rational response to the specific fear that the resource wars had produced was the specific response of seeking the protection that the Vault program offered. What the application process produced, before any vault door had sealed and before any experimental protocol had been initiated, was a population that had been specifically selected and specifically prepared for the specific relationship to institutional authority that the program's experimental design required. The people who successfully secured vault spots were people who had demonstrated willingness to engage with institutional systems, to provide personal information to institutional actors, to subordinate their individual preferences and circumstances to the institutional requirements of the application process, and to accept the specific terms of the institutional relationship that the Vault program offered, which were the terms that the promotional materials communicated, which were the terms of protection in exchange for the specific compliance with Vault operational requirements that living within the Vault's managed environment demanded. They had consented, in the specific sense that pre-war institutional frameworks recognized consent, to the relationship that the promotional materials described. They had not consented to the relationship that the experimental protocols established, because the experimental protocols had not been disclosed in the promotional materials, or in the application process, or in any communication that the program made to the civilian population seeking its protection. The consent that was given to a program that did not exist. The program that existed was the one whose experimental protocols the institutional records document. The specific aesthetic of the Vault's interiors, the warm colors, the functional but domestic organization of the living spaces, the specific attention to the environmental design elements that communicated care for the inhabitants' comfort and well-being, was itself a component of the experimental design, rather than a straightforward expression of the corporation's concern for its residents. The environmental design of any specific vault was specified in relation to that vault's specific experimental protocol, the specific conditions that the experiment required the population to inhabit, calibrated to produce the specific variables that the experiment was designed to study. A vault whose experimental protocol involved the study of social dynamics under resource scarcity was designed with specific resource limitations built into its infrastructure. A vault whose experimental protocol involved the study of how populations responded to specific environmental stresses was designed with the specific stresses built into its environmental systems. The warmth and the domestic comfort and the specific quality of care that the interiors communicated were present where the experimental design required them, and absent where the experimental design required their absence. Organized entirely around the research objectives, rather than around the welfare of the people living within the designed environment. The Vault-Tec promotional infrastructure extended beyond the direct marketing of the Vault program into the specific cultivation of a cultural presence that embedded the brand's identity into the pre-war civilian population's daily life in ways that preceded and supported the specific commercial relationship of Vault spot acquisition, the merchandise, the television appearances, the specific presence of the Vault-Tec brand across the full range of the pre-war consumer landscape. All of this constituted the broader brand environment within which the specific commercial relationship of the Vault program was embedded, and within which the specific trust that the Vault program required was cultivated across the years and decades before the bombs fell and the specific moment of decision arrived for the civilians who had been living within the brand environment across those years. The trust was not produced in a single moment of crisis-driven decision-making. It was produced across the full span of the pre-war period, through the sustained presence of a brand whose public communications had consistently associated it with the specific emotional content of protection and care, and institutional reliability and whose relationship to the people it was communicating with had been organized, across that entire span, around the specific commercial objective of converting that emotional association into the specific institutional relationship of Vault program enrollment. What the public presentation of the Vault program ultimately reveals about the specific institutional actor that constructed and maintained it is the revelation that the Vault-Tec Corporation had developed, across the full span of its engagement with the pre-war civilian population, a comprehensive and technically accomplished capability for the production of a specific appearance whose primary function was the concealment of a specific reality. The appearance was the appearance of institutional care, of a corporation whose mission was the protection of the American civilian population from the specific threat that the resource wars were making increasingly real, and whose products and communications and brand presence all expressed the specific orientation toward its consumers' welfare that the mission implied. The reality was the specific research program whose experimental protocols and the institutional records document the program that understood the people seeking the corporation's protection, not as the beneficiaries whose welfare the mission was supposed to serve, but as the subject population whose existence in the specific conditions of the sealed vault environment provided the specific research opportunities that the program's actual objectives required. The promotional materials were not simply optimistic, they were specifically, deliberately, and comprehensively organized around the concealment of this gap, around the production of the specific understanding in the civilian population that would generate the specific enrollment in the program that the research agenda required, and the maintenance of that understanding across the period between enrollment and the specific moment when the vault door sealed, and the specific reality of what the program consisted of became, for the people inside, unavoidable. The Vault-Tec logo appears throughout the wasteland 2 centuries after the Great War, on the sealed vault doors, on the equipment within the vaults, on the promotional materials that survive in the ruins of pre-war buildings and in the specific domestic environments that the bombs preserved, in the specific condition of the moment when the world outside them ended. The logo still bears the Pip-Boy's smile. The smile has not changed in 200 years. The specific population that the smile was produced to reassure has been transformed by the specific program that the smile was designed to conceal into the specific wasteland that the player of any Fallout game inhabits from the first moment of their engagement with the franchise. The smile is still there. The people it was produced to reassure are the wasteland. The gap between the two facts is the gap that the Vault program opened, and that the full accounting of what the program was and what it did to the specific human beings inside it is the necessary engagement with. The Vault-Tec Corporation did not begin as the institution that the Vault program's experimental records document it as having become. This is the first distinction that the honest accounting of the corporation's history requires, the distinction between the institution that the available evidence suggests Vault-Tec was at its founding, and the institution that the surviving documentary record establishes it had become by the time the Vault program was fully operational. A distinction that is significant not because it exonerates the corporation's later conduct, but because it illuminates the specific process through which an institution organized around a stated purpose becomes an institution, organized around a different and undisclosed purpose. The specific mechanism through which the gap between institutional presentation and institutional reality opens and widens, and eventually becomes the primary structural feature of the institution's existence. Vault-Tec had been, in its earlier institutional life, a company in the specific business of constructing underground facilities, a contractor whose capabilities in the domain of subterranean construction had attracted the attention of the pre-war government's defense planning apparatus at the specific moment in the resource war's escalation, when the question of civilian survival infrastructure had acquired the specific urgency that large government contracts require. The government contract that initiated the Vault program was, from the government side of the transaction, a contract for the construction of civilian survival infrastructure for the physical facilities that would provide the American civilian population with protection from the nuclear exchange that the defense planning apparatus had. Determined was becoming sufficiently probable to warrant specific preparation. From Vault-Tec's side of the transaction, the contract was something more than a construction project. It was the specific opportunity that the corporation's leadership had identified as the mechanism through which Vault-Tec could convert its construction capability into something more institutionally significant and more commercially durable than the construction of individual facilities, which was the role of the permanent administrator and long-term operator of the facilities it built, and the permanent institutional relationship with the population those facilities housed. The specific terms of the government contract and the specific relationship between those terms and the experimental protocols that the Vault program eventually administered are not fully documented in any single surviving institutional record. The specific documents that would establish with complete clarity what the government understood it was authorizing when it contracted with Vault-Tec for the Vault program's development are not available in the franchise's accessible archive in the form of a single, comprehensive account. What is available is the accumulation of specific documentary fragments, terminal entries, holotape recordings, the specific institutional communications that survived the Great War in the Vault's own archives, and in the ruins of the pre-war facilities connected to the program that together establish, with sufficient specificity, general character of the relationship between the government's stated objectives and Vault-Tec's actual program. The government wanted survival shelters. Vault-Tec wanted research opportunities. The specific contract that resulted from the negotiation between these two objectives produced the program that the franchise documents, a program that served the government's stated objective of civilian protection in the 2000 specific sense of constructing physical facilities that provided some protection from the immediate effects of nuclear exchange, while simultaneously serving Vault-Tec's research objectives through the specific experimental protocols that the program administered within those facilities, and that the government's oversight of the program had been specifically managed to prevent from becoming visible to the officials whose institutional position would have required them to object to what the protocols represented. The research agenda that the experimental protocols served was not a single, unified research program with a single, clearly defined objective. It was the aggregate of the specific research questions that different institutional actors within Vault-Tec and within the government agencies whose partnership with Vault-Tec constituted the program's institutional. The Foundation had identified as most valuable questions, organized around the specific domains that the post-war planning apparatus had determined would be most critical for whatever civilization emerged from the nuclear exchange, including questions about human social organization under conditions of extreme stress and resource scarcity, questions about behavioral modification and social control in confined populations, questions about long-term genetic and biological effects of various environmental conditions, questions about the mechanisms through which institutional authority could be most effectively maintained in the specific conditions of isolation and dependency that the Vault environment would create. The range of the questions is itself informative about the range of the institutional actors whose interests the program was serving. It is too broad and too diverse to reflect the research agenda of a single institutional actor, too specifically organized around the questions most relevant to military and governmental planning in the post-war period, to reflect the research agenda of a purely commercial actor, and too comprehensively developed across such a wide range of experimental methodologies to have been assembled in the specific time frame between the government contract's initiation and the program's operational deployment, without the specific resources and the specific institutional relationships that only the program's actual scope of governmental involvement could have provided. The internal research division of Vault-Tec, the specific organizational unit whose existence the franchise has documented through the specific institutional communications and research planning documents that the Vault archives contain, was not an incidental component of the corporation's institutional structure. It was the specific locus of the program's actual purpose, the unit whose researchers developed the experimental protocols and whose administrators managed the relationship between the specific research objectives and the specific Vault designs that would serve them. The researchers within this division were not people who had decided to harm human beings for the satisfaction of harm. They were researchers, people whose professional training and professional identity were organized around the specific practice of designing and executing research programs that generated data about specific questions, and who understood the Vault program as the specific opportunity that it genuinely was from a research design perspective, the opportunity to study human behavior in controlled conditions of extraordinary specificity and duration, with subject populations that could not exit the experimental environment and whose behavior could therefore be observed across the full span of the experimental conditions without the specific confounds that the ordinary mobility of research subjects introduces into studies conducted in non-controlled environments. From within the specific professional framework of researchers whose training had been organized around the value of controlled experimental conditions and whose institutional incentives rewarded the generation of clean, publishable, fundable data, the Vault program's subject population was the most extraordinary research opportunity that the history of the specific disciplines they practiced had ever produced. The specific ethical frameworks that would have required them to evaluate this opportunity differently were frameworks that their professional training had not adequately developed, and that the institutional structure within which they were operating had been specifically organized to prevent from interfering with the program's execution. The specific mechanism through which the ethical evaluation of what the program was doing to its subject population was prevented from arising at the level where the researchers responsible for the experimental protocols would have been required to engage with it was the mechanism of institutional fragmentation, the specific organizational design that assigned different aspects of the program to different institutional actors whose individual functions were sufficiently separated from the aggregate of what the functions were collectively producing that no individual actor's professional responsibility extended to the full accounting of what their specific function was contributing. 2. The researcher who designed the experimental protocol for Vault-11 understood themselves as designing a research protocol as specifying the experimental conditions and the data collection methods and the behavioral observation frameworks that the specific research question about human social behavior under conditions of institutional coercion required. The Vault designer who translated that protocol into the specific architectural and engineering specifications of Vault-11's physical environment understood themselves as translating a research protocol into building specifications as performing the specific technical function of the construction discipline without engaging with the ethical dimension of what the building they were specifying was being built to house. The overseer who administered the protocol within the completed Vault understood themselves as the administrator of a complex institution in difficult circumstances, as the specific occupational role of institutional management in challenging conditions, rather than as the administrator of a program of systematic harm to a captive human population. Each professional, within the specific domain of their specific function, was doing their job. The aggregate of their doing their jobs was the specific program that the franchise's documentary record establishes. The government's relationship to the oversight of the program it had funded represents the specific institutional dynamic that the franchise has examined with particular comprehensiveness through the surviving records of what the pre-war oversight apparatus looked like and how it functioned in relation to the Vault program. The oversight existed in the formal sense, the specific regulatory and administrative frameworks that governed large government contracts in the pre-war period applied to the Vault program in the specific ways that those frameworks applied to defense contractors operating in the national security domain, which was primarily in the sense of establishing the documentation requirements and the reporting structures and the audit mechanisms that the oversight framework mandated. What the oversight frameworks in the specific conditions of the pre-war period did not provide, in relation to the Vault program, was the specific, substantive examination of what the program was actually doing, the specific engagement with the experimental protocols and their human consequences that would have required the officials responsible for oversight to have access to the classified research planning documents that Vault-Tec's information management systems had organized to prevent from reaching the level of the oversight framework where they would have been available for evaluation. The oversight officials received the reports that the program's information management system determined they should receive. They evaluated those reports using the analytical frameworks that the program's technical representatives had contributed to developing. They produced assessments that the program's institutional relationship with the oversight structure had been designed to render favorable. The oversight existed. It was not adequate to the reality it was supposed to be overseeing. This is the specific institutional dynamic that the franchise consistently identifies as the primary mechanism through which institutional harm operates at scale. The conversion of the oversight relationship from a genuine external accountability into a managed communication channel whose primary function is the production of the appearance of accountability rather than its substance. The physical specifications of the individual vaults, the specific engineering decisions about capacity and environmental systems, and the particular configuration of living spaces and operational areas were organized at every level of their development around the dual requirements of the public presentation and the experimental reality. The public requirement was the requirement of the promotional materials. The vault needed to be large enough and well appointed enough to support the specific image of comfortable institutional protection that the brand was selling. The experimental requirement was the requirement of the specific research protocol assigned to that vault. The environmental systems needed to be capable of the specific manipulations the protocol required. The population capacity needed to be calibrated to the specific demographic composition that the experimental design specified. The architectural organization of the living and operational spaces needed to accommodate the specific observational and data collection functions that the research program required without those functions being visible to the population, being observed. The tension between these two requirements, the requirement to appear to be the shelter, the promotional materials described, while actually being the laboratory, the research agenda required is present in the physical specifications of the vaults in ways that the franchise's most careful documentary content makes available for examination, in the specific architectural choices and the specific engineering decisions that make sense in the context of the research agenda and that do not make sense as straightforward expressions of the goal of protecting and housing a civilian population comfortably across an extended period. What the full institutional architecture of Vault-Tec's program reveals about the specific character of the pre-war world that produced it is the character of a civilization that had developed extraordinary sophistication in the management of the gap between what its institutions presented themselves as being and what they actually were, that had refined across the specific institutional evolution of the pre-war period. The specific combination of regulatory capture and information management and professional fragmentation and the cultivation of public trust through the sustained production of appearances that the specific program represented in its most comprehensively realized form. Vault-Tec was not exceptional in the pre-war landscape. It was the most complete, available expression of institutional tendencies that the pre-war world had been developing across a much wider range of institutional contexts. The most ambitious, most technically accomplished, most comprehensively executed version of what the specific institutional logic of the pre-war corporate and governmental landscape consistently produced when it was applied with sufficient resources and sufficient regulatory latitude to an objective of sufficient scale. The Vault program was this logic at its most fully realized. The specific horror of what the program administered was not the horror of institutional aberration. It was the horror of institutional normality, of what ordinary institutional processes produce when they are organized around objectives that treat human beings as resources rather than as the persons whose welfare of the institutions exist to serve, and when the specific accountability mechanisms that might have interrupted the production of those outcomes have been specifically and successfully managed into ineffectiveness. The people who entered the vaults on October 23rd, 2077 were not, in the specific hours of that morning, thinking primarily about the Vault program or about Vault-Tec or about the specific institutional framework they were entering. They were thinking about what everyone thinks about in the specific hours of October 23rd, 2077, who understood what was happening. They were thinking about the bombs, about the specific reality of nuclear exchange as an event occurring in the present, rather than as a possibility organized somewhere in the future, about the specific people they were with and the specific people they were not with, and the specific calculations about whether there was time to reach the people they were not with before the door closed, and whether the door would still be open when they got there. The chaos of the entry period, the specific social conditions of thousands of people converging on vault entrances with their single bags in the specific compressed time frame between the announcement of incoming missiles and the detonation of the first warheads is documented in fragments across the franchise's records. In the holotapes of people who recorded themselves in the process of making their way to the vault entrance, and in the terminal entries of vault staff managing the specific operational challenge of processing a large civilian population through the entry sequence in conditions of acute crisis. The fragments establish the specific texture of the experience without providing any single comprehensive account. And the texture they establish is the texture of people in the specific condition of genuine existential emergency people, whose ordinary cognitive frameworks for processing information and making decisions were operating under the specific stress of a situation that exceeded anything those frameworks had been developed to address. Some people arrived at the vault entrance to find the door closed. This is the specific horror adjacent to the primary horror of what happened inside the vaults. The specific experience of the people who had applied and been accepted, and who, for specific reasons of distance or timing or the particular chaos of a morning when the social infrastructure of daily life had simultaneously ceased to function, did not reach the vault entrance before the operational timeline required the door to seal. The franchise has preserved fragments of this experience in the specific form of the holotapes and the terminal entries of people who recorded themselves in the specific condition of being outside a closed vault door with bombs falling. The specific quality of a person who has done everything the institutional framework asked of them, and who is discovering that the institutional framework's obligations to them did not extend to the specific moment when the fulfillment of those obligations became most urgent. These fragments are among the franchise's most specifically devastating documentary content, not because they describe dramatic suffering in any theatrical sense, but because they describe the specific, ordinary human experience of a person who trusted an institution and who is encountering the specific evidence that the trust was not warranted in the specific conditions that made the trust most important. The people who did get inside, who made it through the entry sequence in the specific compressed time frame between the announcement and the detonation, who found their place in the Vault's organized intake process and received their Vault suit and their room assignment and the specific orientation materials that the program provided for new residents, entered the Vault in a specific psychological condition that the experimental protocols were designed to account for and to use. They were frightened. They were relieved to be inside rather than outside. They were disoriented by the specific combination of the acute crisis they had just navigated and the immediate requirement to begin navigating the specific institutional environment of the Vault, whose organizational structure and whose operational requirements were different from anything in their prior experience in ways that the orientation materials could describe but could not fully prepare them for. They were grateful, specifically and genuinely grateful, to the institution that had told them it would protect them and that appeared in the specific immediate evidence of the sealed door and the functioning environmental systems and the organized operational environment of the Vault's interior to be delivering on that promise. The gratitude was the specific emotional condition that the program's design had been organized to produce in the entry period, the emotional condition in which the population's relationship to the institutional authority of the overseer would be most firmly established on the specific foundation of genuine relief and genuine appreciation that the program's designers had understood were the most durable, available basis for the specific institutional compliance the experimental protocols required. The overseer's introduction to the Vault's population in the specific hours following entry is documented in some canonical contexts as a formal address, and in others as the more gradual institutional communication of the Prosh. Vault's organizational structure, through the specific practical requirements of processing a large group of people into a new institutional environment, assigning living spaces, organizing meal schedules, distributing the equipment and the orientation materials that the Vault's operational design required its residents to have, regardless of its specific form in any particular Vault's history. The overseer's introduction performed the specific function of establishing the institutional relationship between the overseer's authority and the population's position within the Vault's organizational hierarchy. The specific communication of who was responsible for what within the Vault's operational structure and what the population's relationship to that structure required of them in terms of compliance and cooperation, and the specific deference to institutional authority that the Vault's continued functioning demanded. The people receiving this communication were people who had just watched the world they had known be destroyed in the specific, literal sense of nuclear exchange. People whose entire prior institutional framework had been simultaneously eliminated. People who were now entirely dependent on the specific institution whose operational requirements the overseer was communicating to them. The dependency was real. The institution knew it was real. The experimental protocols had been designed with the full knowledge of it. The specific moment when the experimental reality of any particular Vault's protocol became visible to the population, experiencing it, varied enormously across the range of experimental designs that the program had deployed. In some Vaults, the experimental protocol was immediately visible from the first hours of the Vault's operation, was, in fact, the specific condition of the Vault's environment that the population encountered upon entry, rather than a revelation that emerged gradually from what the entry conditions had initially concealed. In other Vaults, the experimental protocol operated for weeks or months or years before the population developed sufficient awareness of what was happening to understand the Vault's conditions as experimental rather than as the simply difficult, natural consequences of long-term underground habitation in conditions of limited resources and limited space. In still others, the experimental protocol operated across the full span of the Vault's documented history without the population achieving sufficient understanding of the protocol's designed character to engage with it as an experiment. Without the population ever fully crossing the specific epistemic threshold between experiencing the Vault's conditions and understanding those conditions as the deliberate product of an institutional design organized around their experience of them. The range of the moments of revelation across the range of the Vault program's documented experimental designs is itself informative about what the program understood its relationship to its subject population's awareness to be, which was the relationship of an institution that needed its subjects to be in the specific conditions the experimental design required, without needing them to understand why those conditions existed, and that had organized the specific information environment of each vault to provide whatever degree of subject awareness was compatible with the experimental objectives, and to prevent whatever degree of subject awareness was not. What the first hours and days inside any vault produced in the specific people who had just entered was the specific combination of genuine relief, genuine disorientation, genuine institutional dependency, and the particular quality of psychological suspension that acute crisis, followed by apparent safety, produces in people whose nervous systems have been operating at the specific level of activation that genuine existential threat generates. A suspension in which the ordinary critical faculties that evaluate institutional environments and institutional claims are operating below their ordinary capacity, in which the specific gratitude of being inside rather than outside produces a specific orientation toward the institutional framework that made the inside available, that is more trusting and less evaluative than the orientation the same. People would have brought to the same institutional environment in conditions that had not just included the destruction of the entire world outside the door. The program's designers had not simply observed this psychological dynamic. They had designed around it, had organized the specific timing of the program's initiation and the specific character of the entry period's institutional communications to coincide with the specific period of maximum psychological suspension, maximum institutional dependency, maximum gratitude, and minimum critical evaluation. The population entered the vault in the specific psychological condition that the program required them to be in. The door sealed. The experiment began. The person who stood before Vault 11's population to deliver the announcement that would organize the next several decades of the Vault's social history was either an overseer who understood the announcement to be false, or an overseer who had been given the announcement as their operational mandate without being informed of its specific character as a fabrication. The franchise's documentary record of Vault 11 does not establish with complete clarity which of these two situations obtained, and the ambiguity is itself one of the most significant features of the Vault 11 case as an illustration of how the Vault program's experimental architecture operated. The announcement was the announcement that the Vault's automated management systems required an annual human sacrifice, that one resident of Vault 11 must be delivered to the overseer's office each year to be killed, or the automated systems would execute the entire population. The threat was entirely invented. The automated systems had no such capacity and no such programming. The annual death that the threat specified was not a requirement of any operational system within the Vault, but a research design element, the specific experimental condition that the protocol required the population to be in, whose imposition required the construction of a specific false institutional reality that the population had no available mechanism for verifying as false. The specific research question that Vault 11's experimental design was organized around is the question that its documentary record most directly poses the question of what a confined civilian population will do when confronted with an institutional demand for the regular murder of its own members. The question is not, in the abstract, a research question without legitimate intellectual content. It is a version of the specific question about institutional compliance and the limits of social authority that the social sciences have examined across a range of experimental and observational contexts, and whose most important real-world answers have come from exactly the kind of historical circumstances that the Vault program's designers had the specific professional background to be aware of. But the abstract legitimacy of the research question as an intellectual inquiry does not address the specific ethical character of the method through which the Vault program's designers chose to investigate it, which was the method of actually imposing the conditions that the question was about on an actual population of actual human beings who had not consented to be in an experiment about those conditions, and who were in those conditions because they had trusted the institution, imposing the conditions to protect rather than to study them. The distance between the intellectual legitimacy of the question and the specific moral character of the method of its investigation is the distance that the experimental framework had been specifically organized to prevent the researchers responsible for the protocol from being required to cross. The social dynamics that the announcement produced in Vault 11's population across the first period following its delivery are documented in the Vault's terminal records with the specific granularity of close observation. Observation that was built into the Vault's monitoring infrastructure as a designed feature of the experimental protocol's data collection requirements, and that therefore preserved in the institutional record the specific texture of what the population's engagement with the announcement produced in their social organization in ways that a population uninstrumented for observation would not have preserved. The first response was disbelief, the specific quality of a population that had just survived the destruction of the world, that was entirely dependent on the institutional framework of the Vault for every dimension of its continued existence, and that was now receiving from that institutional framework the specific communication that the framework required the population's participation in killing one of its own members, the specific cognitive and emotional response to this communication in a population that had not been prepared for it and that had no external reference points against which to evaluate it, was a response that the terminal records characterize in the specific language of stunned incomprehension. People did not immediately believe the announcement was real. They sought confirmation. They asked questions. They expressed the specific forms of resistance that people express when an institutional communication exceeds the range of what their prior relationship to the institution had prepared them to process as the kind of thing the institution would communicate. The confirmation that the Vault's institutional framework provided was not the confirmation of independent evidence, was not the specific examination of the automated systems that would have established that the threat they were supposed to embody was fabricated. It was the confirmation of authority, the specific institutional communication that the overseer's position invested with the weight of the only available source of authoritative information about the Vault's operational conditions in a sealed environment without external reference points. The overseer confirmed the announcement. The institutional structure of the Vault had been designed to make the overseer's confirmation the most authoritative available evidence about the Vault's actual conditions. The population was in a sealed environment without access to the automated system's actual programming. They could not independently verify the threat's reality through any available mechanism that the Vault's design permitted them to access. They had the overseer's confirmation and the specific psychological conditions of people who had just survived a catastrophe and who were entirely dependent on the institutional framework of the Vault for their continued survival. Conditions that produced in most of the population the specific, reluctant acceptance of an institutional reality they could not verify, because the alternative, which was to refuse acceptance and face whatever consequences the refusal produced in the specific conditions of their total dependency on the institution making the demand, was a choice whose specific cost was higher than most people, in most circumstances, are capable of sustaining as a position. The political and social process through which the first sacrifice was selected is documented in the terminal records as the specific emergence of the community institutions, the formal governance structures, and the informal social hierarchies, and the specific political dynamics of a confined population managing an acute collective crisis that the research protocol had been designed to observe. The population formed committees. It held meetings. It debated the specific ethical frameworks within which the selection of a sacrifice could be conducted in a way that the population could understand as something other than the simple exercise of lethal power by whoever happened to be strongest or most politically influential. It developed the specific procedural justice mechanisms, the rules and the processes, and the specific institutional forms that the human impulse toward fairness produces, even in conditions that are themselves profoundly unjust. This is among the most specifically documented dimensions of Vault-11's history in the available record. The specific effort of people who had been placed by the institutional design of the program in a situation requiring them to participate in the killing of one of their members, to develop the specific institutional forms that would make that participation feel like something other than what it was, which was participation in the killing of one of their members. The person who was selected in the first year and who was killed in the first year was a specific person whose name the franchise's canonical record has not preserved with the same specificity as the record of the political process through which the selection occurred. A specific person who had entered Vault 11 with their single bag on the morning of October 23rd, who had been relieved to be inside rather than outside, who had received their vault suit and their room assignment, and who had begun the specific process of adjusting to the specific conditions of the sealed environment, and who was killed approximately 1 year later because the institutional framework they had trusted to protect them had designed a situation in which their neighbors were presented with a choice between killing them and dying, and their neighbors had made the choice that the experimental design had predicted they would make. The person was killed. The automated systems did not execute the population. The experiment continued for another year, another year, another year. The killing became a feature of the Vault's social and institutional landscape, a recurring event that the population had developed. The specific institutional frameworks for managing and the specific psychological mechanisms for living with, and the specific social customs for discussing or not discussing that recurring engagement with the institutionally required killing of a neighbor produces in a confined population across multiple iterations. The research protocol was collecting exactly the data it had been designed to collect. The 5 specific deaths across the years of Vault 11's sacrifice lottery before the group of inhabitants who finally refused to comply constituted the specific human cost that the experimental protocol extracted from the population in the process of generating the data that the research question required 5 people, each of whom had entered the vault trusting in its protection, each of whom died because the institutional design of the program had constructed the specific conditions in which their deaths served a research objective. The franchise has not provided the full biographical detail of each of the 5 that would allow them to be known as the specific individuals they were, rather than as the abstract count of the experimental protocol's direct mortality. But the 5 deaths are 5 real deaths in the specific sense that the Vault 11 sacrifice lottery was a real program whose real consequences the franchise documents. 5 people who died inside a structure that had presented itself as a survival shelter, killed not by the nuclear exchange from which the shelter had promised to protect them, but by the specific experimental design of the institution whose protection they had sought. The rebellion, the specific year in which a group of Vault 11's inhabitants refused to provide the annual sacrifice, organizing themselves around the specific collective decision. that the compliance they had been maintaining across the years of the lottery's operation was a compliance they were no longer willing to sustain, was the specific event that the research protocol had been designed to study as its terminal outcome, the specific answer to the research question about the limits of institutional compliance under conditions of sustained, lethal demand. The rebellion was not the heroic moment that its summary description might suggest. The specific events that preceded it and the specific events that followed it are documented in the terminal records with the complexity that genuine human situations always have when they are documented with sufficient specificity to reveal that complexity. The people who organized the rebellion had been participants in the compliance whose limits they had now reached. They had been members of the committees and the governance structures and the specific political processes through which 5 of their neighbors had been selected and killed across the preceding years. The rebellion was not the first engagement of the Vault's population with the moral reality of what the lottery required of them. It was a specific later engagement, the specific point at which some of the population reached the specific threshold at which the cost of continued compliance exceeded the perceived cost of refusal, in conditions that the research protocol had been specifically designed to push the population toward across the accumulated years of compliance. What the automated systems actually did when the sacrifice was refused is the specific revelation of the Vault-11 case that the franchise preserves with the specific directness of a recorded institutional message. The computer's response to the refusal established that the threat had been false, that the automated systems had not been programmed to execute the population, that the annual sacrifice had not been required for any operational reason, but had been required by the research protocol, whose existence the population was now, for the first time, confronting as the specific institutional reality that had been organizing their experience across the years they had been living within it. The recorded message that met the group who had refused the sacrifice acknowledged what the Vault program was. It did not apologize for it. It communicated the research protocol's conclusions with the specific institutional matter-of-factness of a program documenting its experimental findings, the finding that the population had maintained compliance with the sacrifice lottery across 5 iterations before reaching the refusal threshold, which was presented as a data point rather than as a moral accounting of what the program had done to produce it. The 5 people who had died were not mentioned in the message as people. They were the implicit cost of the data that the message was presenting as the research protocol's findings. The program had gotten what it came for. The 5 people who had died were the price of the data. The institution that had designed and administered the program experienced the findings as findings. It did not experience the 5 deaths as the 5 deaths they were. What Vault-11's complete history reveals about the specific research agenda of the Vault program is the revelation that is most important and most consistently under-examined in the franchise's own canonical engagement with the case, the revelation that the program was not studying human behavior in the abstract, but was studying it for the specific purpose of understanding the mechanisms through which institutional authority could most effectively maintain compliance in confined populations under conditions of lethal demand. This is the specific research question that Vault-11's experimental design was organized to answer. And it is a research question whose specific practical applications are not the applications of basic social science research, but the applications of the specific institutional planning needs of an organization whose post-war operations would require the ability to maintain compliance in confined populations under conditions that the organization understood would include demands that the populations might otherwise resist. The data that Vault-11 generated was not simply interesting social science data. It was the specific operational intelligence that the program's clients, the institutional actors whose interests the Vault program's research agenda served, required for the specific purposes of managing the post-war world that the program's designers understood they were preparing for. The 5 people who died in Vault 11 died so that someone with institutional power in the post-war world would have better information about how to maintain compliance in the specific conditions of the world their deaths had helped to research. The people who entered Vault 87 did not know that the forced evolutionary virus was waiting for them inside. This is the first and most essential fact to establish about the specific population of Vault 87, not because establishing it exonerates the people who designed what was waiting for them, whose moral accountability for what the program produced is not diminished by the population's ignorance of it, but because the ignorance is itself the most important single feature of the Vault 87 case, as an illustration of what the Vault program was and what its relationship to the people within it consisted of. The population entered Vault 87 on October 23, 2077, in the specific conditions of everyone who entered a vault on that specific morning: the single bag, the compressed timeline, the specific psychological condition of people navigating genuine existential emergency while managing the specific relief of having secured a place inside rather than being left outside with the bombs. They carried the specific things that people carry when they understand they may never return to the place they are leaving: the photographs and the documents and the specific small objects that the calculation of what matters most, when space is limited and time is running out, produces in people who have been forced to perform that calculation under conditions of acute crisis. They trusted the institution they were entering. They had applied for their spots and waited for their spots, and in many cases organized significant portions of their pre-bomb daily life around the specific anxiety of whether they would be selected and the specific relief when they were. They entered Vault 87, trusting that the institution that had selected them was the institution the promotional materials had described, which was the institution whose purpose was their protection and whose operational design served their welfare. The FEV was already there. This is the specific horror at the center of the Vault 87 case that distinguishes it from every other documented Vault experiment in the franchise's canonical record. Not simply that the FEV was eventually introduced into the Vault's environment, not simply that the population was eventually exposed to it, but that the exposure was not something that happened to the Vault's population in the course of the Vault's operation as a consequence of some failure or accident or external intrusion. The exposure was designed. It was the specific purpose for which Vault 87 had been built and for which the specific population of Vault 87 had been selected and for which the specific location of Vault 87 in the capital, Wastelands geography had been chosen, a location chosen in part for its accessibility to the Vault-Tec research facility's FEV stockpile, and the specific logistical infrastructure that would allow the virus to be introduced into the Vault's environmental systems within the specific time frame that the experimental protocol required. The promotional materials had described Vault 87 as a survival shelter. The engineering specifications had designed it as a delivery mechanism for the forced evolutionary virus to the specific population the program had assembled within it. The gap between these two descriptions is the gap that the population of Vault 87 inhabited, that they trusted, that they were grateful for, that they had organized the specific final choices of their pre-bomb lives around securing their place within, and that consumed them. The Vault-Tec research facility and its relationship to the Vault 87 experimental design constitutes the most direct available documentation of the specific connection between the civilian Vault program and the military research agenda that had produced the FEV, the connection that the franchise has always presented as one of the most important contextual facts about the Vault program, and that the Vault 87 case makes most specifically visible. Vault-Tec had been developing the forced evolutionary virus under military contract for the specific purpose of producing enhanced soldiers, the specific biological modification that the military enhancement research agenda had, identified as the most promising available mechanism for addressing the specific combat capability limitations of conventional infantry in the conditions of the Resource Wars' later theaters. The research program had produced, by the time of the Great War, FEV strains of sufficient development to demonstrate in controlled laboratory conditions the specific enhancement effects that the military mandate required, the dramatic increases in physical mass and physical strength, the alterations in cognitive processing, the specific radiation resistance that made FEV-modified organisms capable of surviving in environments that would be lethal to unmodified humans. The strains had also produced, in the same laboratory conditions, the specific biological outcome that the enhancement research agenda had documented, but had not elevated to the status of a program-defining problem: the universal sterility of FEV-modified organisms, present in the research data and documented in the records, and not addressed as a fatal limitation of the program's long-term viability because the program's mandate was the development of enhanced soldiers rather than the development of a viable successor species, and the soldiers did not need to reproduce. The specific relationship between Vault-Tec's military FEV research program and Vault-Tec's experimental design for Vault-87 is the relationship of two institutional programs whose respective interests in the same biological technology produced, through the specific institutional negotiations that large government contractors and military research establishments conduct through the shared infrastructure of government contract relationships, the specific collaborative arrangement that Vault-87 represents. Vault-Tec needed a large human subject population for FEV exposure studies at a scale that the laboratory environment could not provide without the specific ethical and regulatory complications that large-scale human experimentation in a non-controlled setting would have generated. Vault-Tec needed research content for the Vault program's experimental agenda and had access to the specific institutional infrastructure, the sealed environment, the captive subject population, the oversight relationship that had been managed into effective non-interference that Vault-Tec's research agenda required. The arrangement that resulted from the intersection of these institutional needs was Vault-87, whose population served both programs simultaneously, without the knowledge or the consent of the specific people whose bodies and lives constituted the arrangement's research material. What the FEV exposure actually produced in the specific people of Vault-87 is the question that the franchise's documentary record approaches through the specific lens of what the capital Wastelands super mutant population represents as the biological legacy of the exposure, the large, green-skinned, dramatically physically enhanced beings whose specific biological character reflects the specific parameters of the Vault-Tec FEV strain deployed in Vault-87's experimental protocol. The transformation was not selective. It was not a process that the exposed individuals underwent with the specific understanding of what was happening to them, or the specific opportunity to engage with what it was producing in their biology and their psychology. The FEV exposure worked on the specific genetic architecture of specific human beings and rewrote that architecture in the comprehensive way that the franchise's biological documentation of FEV consistently establishes, not addressing specific targeted sequences while leaving the surrounding genome intact, but rewriting the genome in its entirety, producing changes that extended across every biological system that the genome governed and that accumulated with the completeness that the transformation of a human being into a super mutant demonstrates in its most visible, physical dimension. The people who had entered Vault-87 with their single bags and their specific photographs and their careful selection of what mattered most became something that the people they had been could not have anticipated becoming. Something whose relationship to the human beings they had been was the relationship of biological continuity without psychological or social continuity, of the same genetic material reorganized by the virus into a form that the original person's identity and memory and accumulated human experience was not fully recoverable from. The specific people of Vault 87 deserve the specific attention that the franchise's documentary record does not always provide them. Deserve to be understood as the specific individuals they were before the exposure, rather than simply as the founding population of the capital wasteland's most persistent post-war threat. They were the engineers and the teachers and the administrators and the families with children who had secured spots in Vault 87 through the specific combination of application and selection and the particular luck of having been chosen rather than excluded from a program whose spots were limited. They had specific histories and specific relationships and specific investments in the particular futures they had been trying to protect when they entered the vault. The transformation produced by the FEV exposure did not simply change their biology. It destroyed the specific persons they had been, in the specific sense that the persons they had been, with their specific histories and their specific relationships and their specific investments in specific futures, were not recoverable in the super mutants that the transformation produced. The super mutants of the capital wasteland carry the biological continuity of the people who entered Vault 87. They do not carry the psychological or social or biographical continuity of those people in any form that allows the specific persons they had been to be accessed or recovered or genuinely continued. The transformation was total. The people were gone. What remained was something genuinely different that carried in its biology the specific evidence of what the institutional design of the program had done to the people it had assembled within Vault 87's walls. The super mutants that post-war explorers encountered across the capital wasteland were not, in the honest accounting of what they were, the monsters that the wasteland's surface presentation of them frequently suggested. They were the specific biological outcome of what the FEV had produced in human beings exposed to it in the specific conditions of Vault 87's experimental protocol beings whose specific relationship to the human beings the exposure had transformed was the relationship that the franchise's most carefully drawn super mutant characters illuminate most directly, which is the relationship of genuine persons navigating the specific challenges of existence in a form that the world around them consistently failed to recognize as personal. Forks, encountered in Vault 87 itself in Fallout 3, represents the franchise's most direct engagement with the question of what the FEV transformation actually preserved and actually destroyed in the specific person who underwent it, a super mutant who had retained sufficient cognitive integrity to maintain a genuine philosophical engagement with their own situation, who understood what had happened to them and who carried that understanding with the specific combination of intellectual clarity and genuine moral seriousness that the franchise reserves for its most carefully drawn characters, regardless of their biological form. Forks was a person. The transformation had not eliminated that. It had made the personhood more difficult to express, and more difficult for the world to recognize, and more costly to maintain in the specific conditions of a wasteland, organized around the premise that super mutants were threats, rather than persons. But the personhood was there. It had survived something that the institutional design of Vault 87 had not intended to preserve, which was the specific quality of genuine consciousness, engaging with its own specific situation, the specific thing that the program had treated as irrelevant in designing the Vault 87 protocol, and whose survival in at least some of the transformation's outcomes was the specific evidence that the program had been wrong about what the people it was experimenting on were. The broader military research legacy of the Vault 87 experimental data, the specific information about FEV's effects on human subjects at the scale of an entire Vault population that the experimental protocol generated, and that the pre-war research establishment had identified as the primary value of the Vault 87 arrangement, was data that the Great War prevented from being used in the specific ways the pre-war program had intended. The bombs fell before the experimental timeline had reached the specific stage at which the data was to be compiled and transmitted and analyzed and applied to the military enhancement program, whose requirements had made the Vault-87 arrangement attractive to West-Tec in the first place. The data existed in the Vault's monitoring systems and in the observable biological outcomes of the transformation, and in the specific documentary record that the Vault's automated infrastructure had preserved across the 2 centuries between the bombs and the events of Fallout 3. But the institutional apparatus that had been designed to receive and apply the data had ceased to exist on October 23, 2077, along with everything else that the specific civilization that had produced Vault-87 had built. What remained in the absence of the intended use was the specific population of supermutants whose existence the protocol had produced, and the specific landscape of the capital wasteland that their presence had shaped across 2 centuries. The specific legacy of an institutional arrangement whose designers had not survived to observe what their arrangement had actually built. The musicians who entered Vault-92 arrived with their instruments. This is the specific detail that the franchise has preserved about the Vault-92 population, and that is the most important single fact for establishing who the specific people inside Vault-92 were before the experimental protocol began to do what it was designed to do to them. They were musicians and creative artists whose specific vocational identity was organized around the specific practice of making things whose value was not utilitarian but experiential, whose relationship to their instruments and to their creative practice and to each other through that practice was the relationship that people who have organized their lives around a shared art form develop across years of professional engagement with that art form. The specific selection criteria for Vault-92's population had identified the creative arts community, specifically the musical community, as the target demographic for the experimental protocol's subject population, and had organized the Vault program's application process in the specific way that would result in a Vault population composed primarily of people who shared that specific professional and vocational identity. The musicians came. They brought their instruments, because musicians bring their instruments the way that people bring the specific things that constitute the core of their identity when they are packing for the end of the world. Not because the instruments were the most practically useful things they could have brought in the specific conditions of an underground shelter, but because the instruments were the specific objects through which their relationship to the most important dimension of their existence was maintained and expressed. And the prospect of losing that relationship alongside everything else the bomb had taken from them was a prospect they had declined to accept when they made their packing decisions. The specific research question that Vault-92's experimental design was organized around is the research question that the musical community's specific social character made most available for the protocols. Designers to study the question of how a community organized around a shared creative practice responds to the experience of unpredictable internal violence whose source the community cannot identify. In conditions of total social closure, where the community's only available relationships are the relationships within the community, and where the violence therefore threatens not simply individual members, but the entire social fabric within which every member's existence is embedded. The subliminal audio signals that the experimental protocol introduced into the Vault's white noise systems were the specific mechanism through which the experimental conditions were generated sounds at frequencies calibrated to interact with human neurological processes in ways that would trigger acute psychotic episodes in susceptible individuals at unpredictable intervals, and without any apparent external cause that the community could identify as the source of the episodes. The specific neurological research that informed the protocol's design was the research that the pre-war behavioral science establishment had been developing into the specific mechanisms through which auditory stimuli at particular frequencies could reliably produce particular psychological effects in susceptible human subjects, research that had been conducted under the theoretical framework of studying vulnerability to psychological disruption for the defensive purpose of understanding how civilian populations could be protected from deliberate psychological attacks, and that had produced, through the specific dual-use logic that characterizes research into psychological vulnerability, the specific applied capability for conducting the deliberate psychological attacks whose theoretical possibility the defensive research framework had been designed to address. The white noise systems in Vault-92's environmental infrastructure were standard features of the Vault's design present in the original specifications as the specific environmental element that research into long-term underground habitation had established as important for maintaining the psychological well-being of populations living in environments without the natural sonic variation that surface living provides, whose absence over extended periods produces specific forms of psychological distress in human beings, whose nervous systems have been calibrated by evolutionary development to expect the specific sonic diversity of the natural environment, rather than the specific sonic uniformity of an engineered underground space. The presence of the white noise systems was therefore not itself unusual or suspicious. It was the specific engineering decision that a good faith effort to design a comfortable long-term habitation environment for an underground population would have produced. What was not standard was the specific modification to those systems that the experimental protocol required the introduction of the subliminal signal generator into the white noise infrastructure, the calibration of the signal frequencies to the specific parameters that the behavioral research had established as most reliably effective at triggering acute psychotic episodes in susceptible individuals, and the programming of the signal delivery schedule to produce the specific pattern of unpredictable intervals that the experimental design had determined would generate the maximum observable effect on the community's social dynamics, without establishing a predictable enough pattern that the community could develop effective countermeasures against it. The modification was invisible to any inspection of the Vault's environmental systems that did not know what to look for. The white noise still sounded like white noise. The population had no mechanism for perceiving the difference between the modified signal and the unmodified baseline. The experimental conditions were in place before the population had finished unpacking their instruments. The first episode is documented in the terminal records of Vault-92's overseer with the specific clinical language of an administrator documenting an unusual operational event, a resident who had exhibited sudden and extreme violent behavior without apparent cause, who had attacked other residents in a way that was inconsistent with their documented behavioral history and that ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the resident with no clear memory of the episode and the community with the specific, unresolved question of what had happened and whether it would happen again. The overseer's initial response was the response that an institutional administrator facing an unexpected behavioral incident in a confined population would provide the isolation of the affected resident, the initiation of whatever medical and psychological assessment protocols the Vault's limited medical resources permitted, and the communication to the broader population of the incident in the specific terms that administrative management of concerning events in confined populations typically employs, which are the terms that acknowledge the event's occurrence, while minimizing the specific alarm that accurate communication of the event's character would generate in people who have no option of removing themselves from the calm environment where the event occurred. The second episode, and the third, and the specific accumulation of episodes across the weeks and months that followed. The first established the pattern that the experimental protocol had been designed to produce, the pattern of unpredictable violence that the community could not attribute to any identifiable cause, that could not be connected to any specific trigger or any specific characteristic of the individuals who experienced the episodes, because the triggering mechanism was the subliminal signal whose presence in the community's sonic environment was invisible to every perception available to the community members trying to understand what was happening to them. The community did what communities do when confronted with unpredictable internal violence, whose cause they cannot identify it, sought explanations, developed theories, tested those theories against the evidence available to it, and arrived at the specific range of conclusions that the evidence available within a sealed environment, without access to the specific information that would have established the actual cause, produces. Some of the theories were medical explanations organized around the specific psychological stresses of long-term underground habitation and the particular vulnerabilities that certain individuals might have to those stresses. Some were social explanations organized around the specific interpersonal dynamics of the community and the particular tensions that the sealed environment's constant proximity had produced between specific individuals. Some were the specific darker theories that communities under sustained unexplained stress eventually develop explanations that attributed the episodes to deliberate individual action, to secret malice rather than uncontrollable compulsion, to the specific hypothesis that someone within the community was choosing to produce the violence rather than being produced by something outside their control. The darker theories were the specific experimental outcome that the protocol's designers had identified as most significant for the research question. The experiment was studying the specific moment at which a community under sustained, unexplained internal violence transitions from collective effort to understand and address the violence to collective suspicion of specific individuals within the community as the source of the violence. This transition is the specific social dynamic whose study the experimental protocol had been organized to observe, because it is the specific transition in which the social fabric of a community, the mutual trust and the cooperative relationships, and the specific quality of collective engagement with shared problems that functional community requires begins to be replaced by the specific social dynamic of suspicion and accusation and the fragmentation of trust that the hypothesis of deliberate internal malice generates in a community that has accepted it. The musical community of Vault 92 had been, in the specific days and weeks following their entry into the vault, a community whose specific shared vocation and whose specific social culture had produced the particular quality of cooperative trust and creative mutual engagement that performing artists develop through the specific practices of collaborative musical work, the rehearsals and the performances, and the specific quality of listening to each other that musical collaboration requires, and that produces between people a specific kind of knowledge of each other that other forms of social engagement do not generate in the same way. The experimental protocol converted this specific social capital into the specific raw material of its own destruction, using the trust and the mutual knowledge that the musical community had developed through their shared practice as the specific infrastructure within which the suspicion and the accusation that the unexplained violence generated would be most devastating when they arrived. The terminal records that document Vault 92's deterioration across the extended period of the experimental protocol's operation are among the most specifically affecting documentary materials in the franchise's Vault archive, not because they describe dramatic events in any theatrical sense, but because they describe the specific gradual erosion of the specific things that made the musical community of Vault 92 valuable as a human community, the specific sequential destruction of the trust relationships and the creative partnerships and the mutual engagement with shared work that the community had built and that the experimental conditions were systematically dismantling. A musician who had been a close collaborator of another musician became, after one of them experienced an episode of violent behavior, someone, the other musician, was no longer certain they could trust, not because the episode had established that the person was dangerous in any deliberate sense, but because the uncertainty about what the episodes were and what caused them and whether they could happen again produced in the community the specific quality of conditional engagement with each other. That is the specific opposite of the unconditional trust that creative collaboration requires. The rehearsals became less frequent. The performances stopped. the specific shared activity that had constituted the community's most important social infrastructure, the making of music together, the specific quality of being in the same room, paying the specific quality of attention to each other that playing music together requires, was the first significant casualty of the experimental protocol's effect on the community, because it was the activity most directly dependent on the specific quality of trust that the unexplained violence was eroding most efficiently. What Vault 92 ultimately produced the specific state of the community at the end of its documented history is a state that the terminal records characterize with the specific compressed horror of official documentation, recording an operational outcome, a community that had destroyed itself from within across the period of the experimental protocol's operation, whose members had died in the specific circumstances of the violence and suspicion and social fragmentation that the subliminal audio signals had generated across their community with the specific efficiency of an experimental design, organized by people who understood very precisely how to use the specific vulnerabilities of a specific kind of human community to produce the specific outcomes they wanted to observe. The instruments were still there in the ruins that post-war explorers found. The music had stopped before the bombs had fallen. The community that had brought the instruments had been consumed by the specific experiment that the institution they had trusted had designed to consume it, an experiment whose specific research question had required their specific, community's specific social character as its raw material, and had used that raw material with the specific thoroughness of a program whose designers had never been required to engage with what they were using. The children who entered Vault 75 did not enter alone. They were carried by their parents, or they walked beside their parents, or they held the hands of the adults who had brought them to the vault entrance on October 23rd, in the specific way that children in emergencies hold the hands of adults, with the specific tightness of a grip that communicates both the child's trust in the adult and the child's awareness that something is happening, that the adult's presence is the primary available protection against. The children of Vault 75 were children in every specific sense that the word carries, people in the early stages of development whose dependency on the adults around them was genuine and total, whose capacity to evaluate institutional environments was limited by the specific cognitive and experiential resources that childhood provides, and whose trust in the institutional framework their parents had brought them into was the trust of children who had no alternative framework for evaluating the specific situation they were in. They were young. The youngest were very young. The oldest were adolescents whose developing capacity for independent evaluation was still embedded in the specific dependency structures of family and institutional authority that adolescence maintains alongside its emerging autonomy. They entered Vault 75 in the care of adults who trusted the institution they were entering. The institution had designed specific plans for both populations, and the plans were very different from each other, and neither population knew what the specific plans for them were. The selection criteria for Vault 75's population had been designed around the specific requirements of the experimental protocol that the Vault had been built to house, which was the protocol for identifying and developing children with exceptional physical and cognitive potential through an intensive training program that the children would be told was a standard educational curriculum, and that was actually the systematic development of enhanced combat capabilities in the specific human beings whose developmental profiles the program's research agenda had identified as the most promising available subjects for the specific form of human potential development that the military contracted research agenda required. The application process for Vault 75 had therefore been organized to produce a population of children with the specific profile that the experimental design required, had incorporated assessment criteria into the current times. Applications documentation requirements that were presented as standard health and educational background information, and that were actually the preliminary screening data through which the program's designers had identified the specific population whose developmental profiles best matched the experimental protocol's target parameters. The parents who had completed the application forms had provided the information that the program needed to select the children it wanted. They had provided it because the forms had asked for it, and because the institution asking for it had presented itself as a protective shelter program. They had not known that the information was being used for the specific purpose of selecting their children for an experimental combat development program. They had trusted the institution. The institution had used the trust to gather the specific information it needed to select the children it wanted. The adult population of Vault-75 was not the community of families that the children had been told they were entering. This is the specific institutional deception at the center of the Vault-75 case that the franchise's documentary record establishes, with the specific directness of terminal records that document what the Vault's operational structure actually was. The adults who populated Vault-75 alongside the children were not parents and neighbors and the various adult community members that a genuine family-oriented survival shelter would have housed. They were the staff of a research facility, people whose presence in the vault was organized around the specific operational requirements of the experimental program, rather than around the welfare of the children, in the sense that genuine parental and community care requires. Some of them were researchers whose professional training was in the specific disciplines relevant to the experimental protocol. Some of them were training specialists whose expertise was in the specific forms of physical and tactical development that the program required. Some of them were administrative personnel whose function was the management of the Vault's operational requirements and the documentation of the experimental data that the protocol was generating. None of them were simply adults whose presence in the Vault was organized around the genuine care of the children in the specific way that the children's developmental requirements demanded. The parents who had entered with their children were not part of the permanent staff structure of the experimental facility. They were the specific transitional population that the program required for the entry period, the adults whose presence made the entry into the Vault comprehensible to the children as the same kind of family-organized, institutional experience that the promotional materials had described, whose continued presence through the initial period of the Vault's operation allowed the children to maintain the specific psychological stability that sudden, complete separation from parental figures would have disrupted in ways that the experimental protocol had determined would compromise the data quality of the program's early phases. What happened to the parents in the subsequent phases of the Vault's operation is documented in the franchise's canonical record with the specific matter-of-fact horror of institutional documentation recording. Operational decisions. The parents were removed from direct contact with the children through the specific mechanisms that the Vault's operational design had been built to accommodate, separated into the portions of the Vault's infrastructure that the children would not have access to, and eventually, in the specific documentation that the most explicit canonical sources provide, disposed of through mechanisms whose specific character the franchise establishes with a directness that the most honest engagement with what the institutional record shows requires acknowledging. The children had been brought to a facility whose design included the specific mechanism for separating them from the adults who had brought them and the specific institutional infrastructure for managing the adults' subsequent presence in ways that served the experimental program's requirements. The adults had not been told that the design included this. The children had not been told that the design included this. The program did not require either population's informed understanding of what the design included. It required their presence. It had their presence. The rest followed from the design. The selection process through which children whose profiles matched the experimental program's target parameters were identified from within Vault-75's child population and advanced into the specific intensive training protocols that the experimental design specified began in the Vault's early operational period through the educational program that the children had been told constituted the Vault's curriculum. The assessments were genuine assessments of the specific capabilities that the program valued: physical strength and agility and endurance, cognitive processing speed and pattern recognition, and the specific spatial reasoning capabilities that tactical training requires, emotional regulation under stress, and the specific psychological qualities that the program's research agenda had identified as predictive of performance. In the specific training contexts, the program would subject the selected children to. The children who scored well on these assessments were told they had done well on their schoolwork. They were given additional opportunities and additional resources and the specific institutional attention that high performers in any educational setting receive from the institutional infrastructure that their performance has. Impressed. They were not told that their performance had identified them as the specific individuals whose capabilities the program most wanted to develop and whose subsequent existence in the Vault would be organized entirely around the program's development of those capabilities, rather than around the children's own development in any sense that the word development implies when it is applied to the welfare of a child, rather than to the optimization of a research subject's performance parameters. The children who did not score well enough on the assessments to be selected for the program's intensive training protocols were in a position that the franchise's documentary record documents with the specific brevity of institutional documentation, addressing a question that the institutional framework had resolved through the specific mechanism of disposing of what was not useful. They were separated from the selected population and managed through the specific operational channels that the Vault's design had included for the management of the non-selected population. The specific fate of the children who were not selected is among the most specifically documented horrors of the Vault 75 case in the canonical sources that address it, documented not through any dramatic narrative account, but through the specific clinical entries of a facility's operational records processing the management of what the program's selection criteria had determined were unusable research subjects in the specific language of inventory management. They were children. The program had decided they were the wrong kind of children for the specific research it was conducting. The program's operational infrastructure included the specific mechanism for addressing the presence of the wrong kind of children. The mechanism was applied. The training program that the selected children underwent was a training program whose specific content and specific methodology and specific daily experience for the children within it, the franchise documents with sufficient detail to establish the specific character of what the program was developing in them and at what cost. The physical training was comprehensive and demanding at a level calibrated to the specific developmental biology of children and adolescents, not the training that adult military recruits receive in programs designed for adult physiology, but the specific intensive physical development program that expertise in child athlete development and military human performance research had established as the most effective approach to maximizing physical capability in developing human beings whose neurological plasticity and skeletal growth made them simultaneously more capable of rapid capability development and more vulnerable to the specific harms of training programs whose intensity exceeded what their developing biology could sustain without consequence. The cognitive training was equally demanding the tactical education and the strategic reasoning exercises and the specific forms of pattern recognition and environmental assessment that combat effectiveness requires. Developed through training methodologies that the program's researchers had identified as most effective for the specific developmental stage of the children they were working with. The program was, from the perspective of its specific operational objectives, technically sophisticated and professionally executed. It was producing the specific capabilities in the specific children that the experimental design had specified as its goals. What the training produced in the children alongside the specific capabilities that the program's operational assessments measured was the specific set of psychological and developmental consequences that intensive military training in children who have been separated from their families in a controlled institutional environment and who have no alternative framework for understanding their situation produces in the human beings undergoing it, consequences that the program's operational records documented not as consequences to be addressed, but as variables to be managed in the specific sense of managed. That means keeping the variables within the range that allowed the experimental program to continue generating the data it was designed to generate. The children in the program were developing exceptional physical and tactical capabilities. They were simultaneously developing the specific psychological adaptations that children develop when the institutional environment in which they are entirely embedded is organized around the production of those capabilities, rather than around the children's welfare in any fuller sense, adaptations whose specific character the franchise has examined through the most carefully observed post-war characters, whose backgrounds include comparable experiences, adaptations that included the specific forms of emotional suppression and authority, dependency, and the particular relationship to violence as a tool rather than as something with moral weight that sustained intensive training in combat. Effectiveness, in the absence of the broader developmental context that healthy childhood requires, produces in the human beings subjected to it. The program was developing the children it had selected. What it was developing them into was not something that the children had chosen to become, and not something that the program's designers had been required to consider as a question of the children's welfare, rather than as a question of the program's output quality. What Vault-75 reveals about the Vault program's relationship to the most vulnerable population, that any institutional framework can house the population of children whose dependency and whose developmental character make them the most specifically requiring of the care that the institutional framework presents itself as providing, is the revelation that represents the most direct available contradiction between the program's public presentation and its operational reality. The Vault program had presented itself to the civilian population that enrolled in it as protection, as the specific institutional expression of care for the people within it, whose most vulnerable members would be the most specifically served by the specific protection the program offered. The Vault-75 experimental design had identified children as the most promising available research population for the specific experimental objectives the military contracted research agenda required had organized. The entire Vault's design and operational infrastructure around the specific requirement of having access to a population of developing children in a controlled environment where the specific interventions, the experimental design, required could be administered without the specific external accountability that the same interventions in any non-controlled setting would have generated. The protection that the program had promised had been provided to the extent that the children were physically inside a structure that protected them from the immediate effects of nuclear exchange. Everything else that the word protection implies the care for the children's welfare in the specific comprehensive sense that children require, the respect for the developmental process of becoming a person that childhood is, and that institutional frameworks housing children are morally required to serve, had been specifically and deliberately excluded from the operational design of the facility that the program's promotional materials had called a vault, and whose actual function was a military research facility for the development of child soldiers using a subject population whose parents had trusted. The program that consumed them, the overseer who administered Vault 11's sacrifice lottery, was a specific person. This is the observation that the franchise's documentary record of the overseer position most consistently requires the observation that the institutional role of the overseer, whose specific function at the intersection of the program's experimental mandate and the human population the mandate was applied to, makes the role the program's most direct human expression, was a role performed by specific people whose specific histories and specific psychological profiles and specific daily experiences of what the role required constituted something that the institutional framework of the program had, organized around the production of a particular kind of compliance, but that the specific people performing the role experienced as something considerably more complicated than any institutional framework's description of it could capture. The selection process for overseers was the most carefully developed component of the Vault program's human capital architecture, more carefully developed in the specific sense of the attention and the resources the program dedicated to it than the selection process for any other population within the Vault, because the overseer's specific position at the intersection of institutional authority and experimental mandate required a specific combination of personal characteristics that was both narrow enough to be genuinely selective and sufficiently common in the pre-war population that the program could identify candidates in the numbers of the program's scale required. The selection criteria for overseers were not the criteria that a genuine community leadership selection process would have produced. A genuine community leadership selection process, a process organized around identifying the people most capable of serving the welfare of the community they would lead, would have produced criteria organized around the specific combination of empathy and judgment and the particular quality of genuine investment in other people's welfare that effective community leadership requires. The Vault program's overseer selection criteria were organized around a different set of requirements, the requirements of an institutional administrator whose primary function was not the welfare of the community they managed, but the maintenance of the specific experimental conditions that the research protocol required, in circumstances where the maintenance of those conditions and the welfare of the community they were managing would frequently and sometimes catastrophically conflict, and where the conflict would need to be resolved consistently in favor of the experimental conditions rather than in favor of the community's welfare, without the specific psychological collapse that might be expected from a person of ordinary empathic development placed in the specific situation of repeatedly choosing institutional mandate over human welfare. The selection criteria that the program had developed for identifying people capable of performing this specific function reliably and across the extended time frame of a Vault's operational period were criteria organized around the function, specific psychological profiles that the pre-war behavioral science research had identified as most conducive to sustained institutional compliance in conditions of moral complexity profiles that included specific dimensions, deference to authority, specific limitations in the empathic processing that converts awareness of other people's suffering into personal moral distress, requiring resolution, and the specific quality of professional identity investment that converts the performance of an institutional role into a source of personal significance sufficient to sustain the role's performance across circumstances that would undermine the role's performance in people whose personal significance was organized around different sources. Some overseers were selected because they understood what they were being asked to do and had demonstrated through the selection processes specific psychological assessments, sufficient institutional deference, and sufficient professional identity investment to be assessed as capable of doing it without the specific forms of resistance that would compromise the experimental program's integrity. The terminal records that survive from these overseers are among the franchise's most specifically affecting documentary materials in the specific way that the most devastating content is often affecting not through any dramatic expression of what the role required of them, but through the specific, matter-of-fact quality of administrative documentation in which the overseer's private record of what they are administering is indistinguishable in tone and register and the specific language of institutional notation from the administrative documentation of any other kind of institutional management in difficult circumstances. The entry that documents the decision to administer the year's sacrifice lottery in Vault 11's hypothetical overseer's private log reads like the documentation of a scheduling decision. The entry that documents the death that follows reads like the documentation of an operational outcome. The specific human being who died is present in the documentation as a case reference rather than as a person. The overseer who wrote the documentation understood what they were documenting. The documentation's language does not reflect that understanding in any way that would allow a reader without prior knowledge of the context to identify the documentation as the private record of a person who has just overseen the killing of one of their neighbors. This is not the documentation of a person who has become monstrous. It is the documentation of a person who has organized their relationship to their own actions through the specific institutional framework that their role provides, who has converted the specific ethical reality of what they are doing into the specific administrative categories that the institutional framework makes available, and who is maintaining that conversion across the sustained period of the role's performance, because the conversion is the specific psychological mechanism through which the role is survivable. The overseers who resisted represent the franchise's documentation of what the selection process's specific limitations produced in the cases where the selection criteria had been insufficiently precise, where the person selected had been assessed as meeting the criteria for sustained institutional compliance, but who, in the actual experience of performing the role in its actual conditions, discovered that the assessment had been wrong in the specific dimension that mattered most. The resistance took different forms in different documented cases. Some overseers resisted the experimental mandate directly, refusing to administer specific protocols or modifying the protocols in ways that the program's monitoring detected as deviations from the experimental design. Some resisted indirectly, through the specific forms of administrative inaction and documentation, irregularity, and the particular quality of institutional non-compliance that people who cannot bring themselves to directly refuse an institutional mandate, cannot bring themselves to fully comply with it, develop as the specific coping mechanism for the specific position of being caught between institutional authority and genuine moral response. Some resisted through the private documentation that constitutes the franchise's most direct access to the overseer's interior experience of the role, through the terminal entries and holotape recordings in which overseers, who were complying externally with the experimental mandate, recorded their private engagement with what the compliance required of them in language whose specific character constitutes a form of witness to their own actions, that the institutional framework of the role made unavailable in any other register. The program's response to overseer resistance is documented across the franchise's canonical content with the specific institutional matter-of-factness that the program's documentation consistently employs for the management of operational problems. Overseers who resisted were replaced through the specific mechanisms that the Vault's operational design had included for the management of overseer non-compliance, with overseers whose assessment had established greater confidence in their capacity for sustained institutional compliance under the specific conditions the role's performance required. The replacement mechanism itself reveals something important about the institutional architecture of the program. The fact that the program had designed replacement mechanisms into the Vault's operational infrastructure before the Vaults had been sealed establishes that the program's designers had anticipated the possibility of overseer non-compliance with sufficient specificity to have prepared for it, which is the specific evidence that the program understood in its design phase that what it was asking the overseers to do was something that some of the people it had selected to do it would find, in the actual conditions of doing it, impossible to sustain. The program designed around this anticipated failure rather than reconsidering the experimental mandate that made the failure predictable. The specific institutional logic of prioritizing experimental integrity over the welfare of every other consideration the welfare of the overseers themselves, the welfare of the populations the overseers were administering, the specific ethical reality of what the experimental mandate required was the logic that the replacement mechanism expressed, as clearly and as directly as any single institutional design element of the program expressed it. The overseers, who did not know the specific cases where the Vault's experimental design had been organized around the concealment of the protocol's true character from the overseer who administered it, using the overseer's own genuine commitment to the population's welfare as the mechanism through which the experimental design was implemented, represent the franchise's most philosophically complex engagement with the question of what moral responsibility consists of in conditions of institutional information management. The overseer who administers a protocol they have been told is a standard operational procedure and who has no access to the information that would establish that the procedure is an experimental manipulation of the population they are genuinely trying to serve, occupies a moral position that the ordinary frameworks for evaluating institutional conduct do not cleanly address. Their actions produce the outcomes that the experimental design requires. They are the specific human agency through which the experimental design's requirements are translated into the specific events that the research protocol produces in the Vault's population. And yet, the specific moral character of their agency in the production of those outcomes is substantially different from the moral character of an overseer who understands what they are doing and does it anyway different in the specific dimension of the relationship between knowledge and moral responsibility that the Western ethical tradition has consistently identified as central to the attribution of culpability, and different in the specific ways that the franchise's most careful canonical treatments of these cases have always honored rather than collapsed into a simplified attribution of either complete innocence or complete guilt. What the overseer position reveals about the Vault program's institutional architecture at its most human dimension is the revelation that the program had organized the specific human interface between its experimental mandate and the Fiat. Populations that mandate was applied to in ways that were specifically designed to produce the institutional compliance the mandate required, while distributing the moral weight of that compliance across a sufficient number of individual actors in sufficiently fragmented forms that no single actor was required to hold the full accounting of what the program was doing in a form that their ordinary moral faculties would have required them to refuse. The overseers who complied were complying with institutional requirements. The researchers who designed the protocols were designing research programs. The government officials who oversaw the contract were managing defense procurement. The construction engineers who built the vaults were building to specification. The marketing professionals who produced the promotional materials were producing institutional communications. The aggregate of all of these specific professional functions, each performed by specific people in their specific professional capacity, was the Vault program, was the specific institutional reality of sealed laboratories and captive subject populations and experimental protocols whose specific human cost the full accounting of the program documents. No single person in the chain of the program's production was required, by the specific nature of their specific function, to hold that full accounting. The program had been specifically organized to ensure that no one was. Vault 22 did not fail in the sense that the program's designers had not anticipated the possibility of the specific failure it represented. The franchise's documentary record of the Vault 22 experimental protocol establishes with sufficient specificity to exclude the hypothesis of inadvertent failure that the conditions that destroyed the Vault 22 population were conditions that the experimental design had deliberately introduced, not the accidental release of a biological contaminant into a Vault's environmental systems through negligence or mechanical failure, but the specific, deliberate introduction of a plant-based organism whose properties the program's researchers had studied and whose specific behavior in a confined underground environment the protocol had been designed. Around observing, the research question that the Vault-22 experimental design was organized to answer was the research question about the specific intersection of biology and survival infrastructure in post-war conditions, about what happens when living biological systems are introduced into the specific environmental conditions of a sealed underground facility, about the specific dynamics of a biological contamination event in a closed system without access to external resources for addressing the contamination, about what the specific human behavioral and social responses to a biological threat in a confined population look like when the threat is both internal and persistent rather than external and episodic. The plant organism that the protocol introduced into Vault-22's environmental systems was not a random choice of biological agent. It was the specific organism whose properties, its extraordinary adaptability to low-light underground conditions, its aggressive colonization of available growth media, and the specific neurological effects that exposure to its spores produced in human beings made it the most effective available agent for generating the specific experimental conditions the protocol required. The spores that the plant organism released into Vault-22's environmental systems produced in the people exposed to them a specific neurological effect that the franchise has documented through the evidence of what post-war explorers found in the ruins of the vault, a fungal infection that colonized the nervous systems of those exposed with sufficient thoroughness to produce in them a specific, altered behavioral state that the surviving evidence characterizes as a state of compelled action, of behavior organized around the specific requirements of the organism's reproductive needs, rather than around the specific needs and intentions of the person in whom the infection was established. The specific horror of this effect, the specific quality of a human being's behavior being redirected from their own intentions toward the specific requirements of a biological agent that had colonized their nervous system, is a horror that the franchise has examined through the physical evidence that post-war explorers encounter in Vault-22, rather than through any narrative account of the specific experience of the people undergoing the infection, because there is no surviving narrative account of that experience in any form that the people experiencing it produced. The terminal records of the Vault-22 population during the period of the infection spread are records that become increasingly sparse and increasingly fragmented as the infection's progression reduced the population's capacity to produce coherent institutional documentation records that trail off in the specific way that evidence of a community's capacity for organized activity trails off when the community's capacity for organized activity is being consumed by a biological process whose specific trajectory is the final fragments of the record document, without having the resources to address. The decision to introduce the specific organism into Vault-22's environmental systems was a decision made by specific researchers who understood what the organism did and who had designed the protocol around what the organism did, and who had therefore made the specific calculation that the value of the experimental data that the organism's introduction would generate was worth the specific cost to the specific people whose environment the organism was being introduced into. This calculation is the specific moral calculation at the center of not just the Vault-22 case, but of the entire Vault program's moral architecture, the calculation that converts a specific human cost into a research value that treats the specific suffering and death of specific people as the acceptable price of specific data, and that had been made with sufficient regularity across the full range of the program's experimental designs to constitute the program's most fundamental operating principle, rather than a regrettable exception to a general orientation toward the welfare of the populations the program housed. The program made this calculation. It made it in designing Vault-11's sacrifice lottery. It made it in deploying FEV in Vault-87. It made it in introducing subliminal audio signals into Vault 92's white noise systems. It made it in designing Vault 75 around the development of child soldiers. And it made it in introducing the plant organism into Vault 22's environmental systems. The calculation was the program. The program was the calculation. The specific human beings on the wrong side of the calculation were the people the program told the world it existed to protect. The vaults, whose populations rebelled against their overseers, constitute the franchise's most direct documentation of what happens when the specific combination of awareness and capability and the particular quality of collective determination that organized resistance requires develops within a confined population that has been placed in the specific conditions that the rebellion's occurrence establishes were sufficiently extreme to overcome the very specific barriers to collective action that the sealed, vault environment created for populations considering resistance. The barriers were real and substantial, the total dependency of the vault's population on the institutional infrastructure that the overseer controlled, the absence of any external support structure or exit option that would allow resistors to remove themselves from the institutional environment rather than directly confronting its authority, the specific information asymmetries that the vault's design had produced between the overseer's position and the population's position in terms of knowledge about what the vault systems could and could not do, and the specific dynamics of a confined population whose members lived in such close proximity to each other that the social consequences of being identified as a resistor were available to the institutional authority as leverage against the resistance in ways that larger and less enclosed social environments would not permit. Against these barriers, the rebellions that the franchise documents represent the specific circumstances in which the conditions the experimental protocols imposed exceeded the specific threshold at which the calculation of resistance became, for a sufficient number of people, more attractive than the calculation of continued compliance. Vault 101 in the capital Wasteland represents the franchise's most extensively documented case of a vault whose design had been organized around the specific experimental hypothesis of perpetual closure, whose experimental protocol was the specific research question about what happens to a human community when the community is told and genuinely believes that the vault will never be opened and that the surface world outside the vault is the permanent and final condition of the world, rather than a damaged environment that might eventually be survivable and to which the vault's population might eventually return. The specific psychological and social consequences of genuine belief in permanent underground habitation, as distinct from the specific psychological and social consequences of temporary underground habitation pending the restoration of surface conditions, were the research question that the Perpetual Closure Protocol was designed to study, and the Vault 101 case documents what the study produced across the specific generational span of the Vault's operational history up to the point of the lone wanderer's emergence. The generations born within the Vault who had never known the surface world and whose entire understanding of the possible conditions of human existence was organized around the specific conditions of the Vault's interior, who understood the sealed underground environment not as the temporary circumstance of a crisis being weathered, but as the permanent and complete description of the world that existed, constitute the specific experimental population that the Perpetual Closure Protocol had produced. Their relationship to the surface world outside the vault door was the relationship of people for whom the surface world was not a real place, but a theoretical construct known to exist in the abstract sense that the vault's educational materials described it, but not available to the specific, embodied imagination that only direct experience of a place produces in human beings, whose relationship to reality is organized primarily through sensory engagement with their actual environment. The lone wanderer's emergence from Vault 101, the specific event that the Perpetual Closure Protocol had been designed to prevent from occurring, and that the overseer's institutional authority had been deployed across the Vault's operational history to maintain the conditions that would prevent it, is documented in the game as the event that reorganizes the Vault's social and institutional landscape in the specific way that the removal of the organizing assumption of perpetual closure from the practical experience of a community that had built its entire social reality around that assumption produces. The Overseer's response to the lone wanderer's departure was the response of an institutional authority managing the specific crisis of the experimental conditions disruption, the deployment of the institutional resources available to the Overseer's position in defense of the experimental condition rather than in service of the population's welfare, which was the specific institutional response that the experimental design's priorities required, and that the Overseer's specific relationship to those priorities as the program's primary human representative within the Vault produced in the specific crisis of the lone wanderer's emergence. The conflict between the Overseer's institutional mandate and the population's welfare was not, in Vault 101's case, a conflict that had been developing slowly across years of gradual, experimental imposition. It was a conflict that the specific event of the emergence had made suddenly and completely visible, had converted from the specific, low-level tension between the institutional management requirements of the perpetual closure protocol and the genuine human needs of the people. The protocol was being administered into the specific, acute confrontation between institutional authority and the specific human desire for connection with the wider world whose existence, the perpetual closure protocol, had been specifically designed to prevent the Vault's population from acting on. What the full range of the Vault program's documented failures and rebellions reveals about the specific relationship between the experimental designs and the populations they were applied to is the observation that every experimental protocol in the program's documented history had been designed without adequate engagement with the specific fact that the populations it would be applied to were populations of specific people whose responses to the experimental conditions would be organized around the full range of their human capabilities and human needs, rather than around the specific variables that the experimental design had identified as the parameters it was interested in studying. The program consistently treated its subject populations as the specific experimental variables that the research questions required them to be, and consistently failed to account adequately for the specific ways in which human beings who are also persons who have histories and needs, and the specific capacity for moral evaluation and collective action that personhood implies, will engage with the conditions that experimental protocols impose on them in ways that exceed and sometimes directly contradict the specific behavioral parameters that the experimental design had specified. The failures were not failures of the populations to behave as the experimental designs required. They were failures of the experimental designs to account for the specific character of the populations they were imposing on the specific failure of a research paradigm organized around the treatment of human beings as experimental variables to produce reliable predictions about how human beings who are also persons will actually behave in the conditions the paradigm imposes. The Vault Dweller, who walked out of Vault 13 carrying a water chip, and the specific psychological inheritance of a childhood spent in a sealed environment, whose entire social world had been organized around the specific conditions of the perpetual closure protocol, whose relationship to the wasteland they were entering was the relationship of a person for whom the world outside the Vault was a theoretical construct rather than a lived reality was. Not, in any simple sense, the product of the Vault program's experimental design in the way that the super mutants of Vault 87 were the product of Vault 87's experimental design, or the fractured survivors of Vault 92's social destruction were the product of that Vault's experimental design. Vault 13's experimental protocol was the isolation study, whose specific research question was about generational transmission of culture and social organization in a closed population, about what a community that had been sealed for 200 years, would look like in its social structure and its values and its relationship to the broader civilization from which the sealing had removed it. The Vault Dwellers' emergence from Vault 13 was not a designed outcome of the experimental protocol, but a circumstantial necessity of the Vault's operational crisis. The water chip's failure was not an experimental design element, but a genuine mechanical failure whose specific consequence of forcing the Vault's population to seek external resources had the specific additional consequence of exposing one of the isolation study's subjects to the external world 2 centuries into the study's intended duration. What the Vault Dweller carried out of Vault 13 and into the California wasteland was the specific inheritance of 2 centuries of the isolation protocol's effects on the community it had produced, the specific social values and the specific relationship to authority and the specific understanding of the world that the Vault's sealed environment had transmitted across the generations between the founding population's entry and the Vault Dweller's emergence. The Vault Dweller had been formed entirely within the specific institutional environment that the isolation protocol had maintained, and the specific character of that formation, the particular combination of the Vault's educational materials and the social norms that the sealed community had developed, and the specific understanding of the outside world that the Vault's informational framework had provided was the specific psychological equipment with which they approached the wasteland's specific conditions. The wasteland they found was not the wasteland that the Vault's educational materials had prepared them to encounter. Because the Vault's educational materials had been organized around the specific informational constraints that the isolation protocol required, and had therefore not provided the Vault's inhabitants with the specific knowledge of what the wasteland was actually like that 2 centuries of post-bomb development had produced. The Vault Dweller encountered the actual wasteland, the specific combination of radiation and poverty, and the particular social formations of people who had been managing survival in genuinely difficult conditions for 2 centuries. Without the specific institutional support that the Vault had provided its inhabitants through the specific lens of a person whose entire prior experience had been the specific managed environment of the Vault, and whose capacity for navigating what they found was both enhanced by the specific skills the Vault's training had developed and limited by the specific gaps in experiential knowledge that a lifetime in a sealed environment inevitably produces. The Master's discovery of the Vault Dweller's origin in the subsequent events of the first Fallout game is the discovery of a person whose specific biological integrity, whose unmodified human genetics, unmarked by FEV exposure and undegraded by the specific combination of chronic radiation and nutritional limitation, and the particular biological stresses of wasteland survival, made them the specific biological anomaly in the time, California wasteland that the Master's Unity program had identified as its most significant available threat, because the Vault Dweller's biological integrity was also the specific evidence that intact human beings, of the kind that the Unity's argument required to be in terminal decline, were in fact viable in the post-war environment in ways that undermined the foundational premise of the Master's case for the Unity's necessity. The Vault Dweller was the Vault program's biological legacy in the specific sense of being a person whose biology had been preserved by the Vault's specific protective function, whose unmodified genetics were available as the specific evidence that the FEV program's premise was wrong at the specific moment in post-war history when that evidence was most consequential. The Vault program had produced the Vault Dweller's biological integrity as the inadvertent consequence of its actual purpose, which was not the protection of its inhabitants' biology, but the study of their social organization in the conditions of the isolation protocol. The program's actual legacy in the Vault Dweller's specific case was something other than and more complex than either its stated purpose or its actual research agenda had intended. The chosen one of Fallout 2 carries the Vault program's legacy in the specific form of a generational inheritance. The specific experience of being the Vault dweller's grandchild in a community whose founding narrative was organized around the Vault dweller's history and whose specific social character had been shaped by the specific person that the Vault program had produced in the specific conditions of its isolation study. Arroyo was the community that the Vault dweller had founded after the exile from Vault 13, after the Overseer's institutional authority had determined that the Vault dweller's exposure to the outside world made them incompatible with the continued integrity of the isolation study's conditions and had expelled them from the Vault whose welfare they had secured. The exile was the specific institutional decision whose specific institutional logic, the logic of the experimental design's requirements, taking precedence over the welfare of the individual whose capabilities had served the community the franchise has always presented as the foundational injustice of the Vault dweller's story, and whose specific consequence of producing Arroyo as the Vault dweller's response to expulsion established the specific community in which the Chosen One grew up, carrying the specific weight of legendary ancestry. The Chosen One's specific situation, the child of the legend rather than the legend, required to perform a role whose definition had been established by a founding narrative that the child had not authored and could not simply inhabit without the specific struggle of becoming the person the role required, rather than simply being the person the ancestry identified, is the franchise's most direct examination of what the Vault program's legacy looks like in the second generation. The communities that emerged from the Vaults, whose populations survived their experimental protocols and eventually made their way to the surface, constitute the specific human material from which significant portions of the post-war California wastelands social landscape was built communities whose specific character had been shaped in ways that the communities themselves were not always able to fully account for or fully understand by the specific conditions of the experimental protocols they had lived through. The Vault City of Fallout 2 is among the most specifically documented of these community formations. The specific community produced by Vault 8's more benign experimental protocol, whose specific social character reflected the specific combination of technological sophistication and the particular quality of institutional insularity that decades of managed existence in a sealed environment had produced in a population that emerged from the Vault with working GECK technology and the specific social values of a community that had been managing its own institutional environment for a generation or more. Vault City's relationship to the broader wastelands population, the specific combination of genuine technological advantage and the particular quality of social contempt that the Vault's conditions had developed in a population whose entire experience of human community had been the experience of the managed Vault environment rather than the experience of the wasteland's more difficult and more open social conditions, was a relationship that the experimental conditions of Vault 8 had produced as much as it was a reflection of any pre-existing character in the founding population. The specific social values of Vault City were not simply the values that the people who entered Vault 8 had brought with them. They were the specific values that the Vault's conditions had produced in the community across the generations of its sealed operation, and that the community had carried into its post-Vault existence as the specific cultural inheritance of the experimental environment. What the full accounting of what the wasteland inherited from the Vault program reveals about the specific relationship between institutional design and cultural legacy is the observation that the Vault program had been one of the most consequential single institutional actors in determining the specific character of the post-war civilization whose development the franchise documents across its full history, not in the sense that the program had intended to shape post-war civilization, whose specific emergence the program's designers had anticipated in the specific ways that their post-war planning research agenda had been organized around, but in the sense that the specific human communities and the specific biological populations and the specific cultural formations that the program had produced through its experimental protocols constituted the specific social and biological material from which the post-war world was built. The supermutants of the capital wasteland were Vault-87's legacy. The Vault City of the California wasteland was Vault-8's legacy. The specific communities that the franchise documents across its different regional settings carry, in their specific social characters and their specific relationships to institutional authority and their specific cultural formations, the specific inheritance of the experimental conditions through which the program had processed the founding populations that produced them. The wasteland is, in this accounting, what the Vault program built, not what the program intended to build, but what the specific human consequences of the program's specific experimental designs accumulated into across the 2 centuries between the bombs and the events that the franchise documents. The fire that burns in a wasteland settlement and the specific people warming themselves around it, the Minuteman who showed up when the settlement called, the wastelander who planted crops in contaminated soil, the doctor who maintained a clinic in a landscape with no medical infrastructure, are people whose existence represents something that the Vault program's experimental designs had not accounted for, which was the specific persistence of genuine human community in the conditions that the program's experimental designs had been organized around studying, and that the bombs and the wasteland had imposed in far more comprehensive form than any experimental protocol could have achieved. The program had studied what confined populations did under imposed conditions of scarcity and coercion and isolation, and the specific demands that institutional authority made of them. The wasteland produced conditions of scarcity and isolation and the specific demands of survival that exceeded anything the experimental protocols had specified. And in those conditions, the specific human communities of the wasteland built something that was not the sophisticated institutional infrastructure of the pre-war world, was not the managed environment of the Vault, was not the product of any specific research agenda or any specific institutional design, but was the specific irreducible human achievement of people who chose to be present for each other in conditions that made every such choice genuinely costly and genuinely meaningful. The Vault program had studied confined human populations for 2 centuries and had generated data about compliance and resistance and social fragmentation and the specific limits of institutional authority in sealed environments. What the wasteland had generated in the 2 centuries of the program's operation was the specific evidence that the program's research paradigm had not been designed to produce the evidence that the most important thing human beings do in the conditions that the program had been studying was not the thing that the program's research questions had been organized around, which was compliance and resistance and social organization under institutional coercion, but the specific thing that the program's paradigm had not included as a variable worth measuring, which was the irreducible choice to remain genuinely present for the specific people around them in conditions where every other available response to those conditions was more individually rational and less costly and less human. The honest accounting of what Vault-Tec's program reveals about the civilization that produced it requires the specific quality of attention that is most difficult to sustain in relation to institutional horror of the program's specific scale and specific character, the attention that refuses the specific comfort of exceptionalism, that declines to organize the accounting around the thesis that the Vault program was an aberration from the pre-war civilization's values rather than an expression of them, and that therefore requires the person performing the accounting to sit with the specific discomfort of the observation that what the program was is what the civilization was, that the specific institutional logic, whose most comprehensively realized expression the program represents, was not the logic of a rogue actor operating outside the civilization's governing frameworks, but the logic that the civilization's governing frameworks had produced and supported and protected across the full span of the program's development and operation. The pre-war American civilization did not produce the Vault program against its own character. It produced the Vault program through its own character, through the specific combination of institutional sophistication and the particular forms of moral blindness that the civilization's specific development had produced in. The specific institutional actors whose decisions constituted the program, operating within the specific regulatory environment that the civilization had constructed, and through the specific professional frameworks that the civilization's educational institutions had developed, and in the specific service of the institutional interests that the civilization's political and economic organization had established as the primary drivers of large-scale institutional behavior. The program was not a betrayal of the civilization's values. It was their specific terminal expression, the most fully realized version of what the civilization's most characteristic institutional tendencies produced when those tendencies were applied with sufficient resources and sufficient regulatory latitude to an objective of sufficient scale. The specific institutional tendencies whose expression the Vault program represents are not tendencies unique to the pre-war Fallout universe's specific fictional civilization. They are tendencies that the real-world history of institutional behavior has documented across a sufficient range of real institutional contexts to establish them as reliable features of how institutions of sufficient scale, sufficient complexity behave when the specific accountability mechanisms that might constrain them have been sufficiently weakened or sufficiently captured by the institutional interests they are supposed to constrain. The tendency to convert ethical questions into institutional risk management questions, to replace the genuine engagement with what an institution is doing to the specific people it affects, with the management of what the institution's engagement with that question would cost the institution in terms of regulatory liability and reputational damage, and the specific operational constraints that genuine ethical accountability would impose. The tendency to fragment the moral weight of institutional actions across sufficient numbers of individual, professional functions that no individual actor's specific responsibility extends to the full accounting of what the aggregate of all the individual functions is producing. The tendency to develop, through the sustained investment in the specific capabilities that the management of appearances requires, a comprehensive institutional competence in the production of the specific presentations that conceal the specific realities that genuine accountability would make visible, the tendency to organize the oversight relationship that is supposed to provide external accountability into the specific managed communication channel that produces the appearance of accountability while insulating the institution's actual conduct from the specific examination that genuine accountability requires. These tendencies are not inventions of the Fallout franchise's imagination. They are observations about how institutions behave that the real-world history of institutional conduct has documented with painful specificity across the full range of contexts in which sufficiently powerful institutions have operated with sufficiently inadequate accountability. The franchise has taken these documented tendencies and has organized a fictional civilization around their most comprehensive possible expression, has built a world in which these tendencies were allowed to operate without the specific constraints that even the imperfect accountability mechanisms of real-world institutional environments impose, and has examined what they produced in that unconstrained form as a way of illuminating what they produce in their more constrained, real-world expressions. The Vault-Tec executive, whose recorded conversation with a government official has been preserved in the franchise's canonical record, represents the most direct available access to the specific quality of institutional self-understanding that the program's designers possess, the specific register in which the people most directly responsible for the program's character understood what they were doing and understood their relationship to what they were doing. The conversation is documented in Fallout 4's canonical content with the specific, casual tone of two institutional actors discussing a significant business arrangement through the specific register that people who have been conducting consequential institutional business for long enough that the consequence has become ordinary to them, characteristically employ a tone that acknowledges the specific significance of what is being discussed without performing the specific moral gravity that a person encountering the discussion for the first time would expect the significance to generate. The executive discusses the experimental protocols with the specific, matter-of-fact quality of a person discussing research design rather than of a person discussing what will happen to the specific human beings inside the vaults. When the experimental designs are implemented, the human beings are present in the discussion as the subject population whose presence in the specific experimental conditions the designs require, not as the specific people whose specific lives will be organized and in many cases ended by what the designs specify. The register of the conversation is the register of institutional normalcy of two people for whom the specific discussion they are having falls within the range of the ordinary professional discourse of their institutional positions, rather than outside it. This is not the register of people who understand themselves as designing atrocity. It is the register of people who understand themselves as doing their jobs in the specific professional context that their jobs have created for them. A professional context in which the specific ethical reality of what their jobs require has been so thoroughly converted into the administrative and commercial categories of institutional operation that the ethical reality is no longer available in its unconverted form to the people whose professional position most directly requires them to engage with it. The specific pre-war American civilization that the Vault program reveals through the lens of its most comprehensive institutional expression was a civilization that had developed across the specific trajectory of its 20th century history an extraordinary capability for the production of institutional surfaces, for the construction and maintenance of the specific presentations that institutions offer to the world in place of the specific realities that the presentations are designed to conceal or manage or convert into more institutionally convenient forms. The Vault promotional materials were the most technically accomplished expression of this capability that the franchise documents the most fully realized version of what the specific combination of mid-century American advertising expertise and the particular institutional interests of the Vault-Tec Corporation produced when those resources were applied to the specific challenge of making a systematic research program on human subjects appear to the civilian population seeking its protection as the specific institutional expression of care for that population's welfare. But the capability was not unique to Vault-Tec or to the Vault program. It was the general purpose institutional capability that the pre-war civilization's specific combination of commercial development and regulatory capture and the particular evolution of the relationship between large institutional actors and the oversight frameworks nominally responsible for their accountability had produced across the full range of the civilization's institutional landscape. Vault-Tec had it in the specific form that the Vault program's specific requirements had developed. West-Tec had it in the form that military research contracting had developed in its institutional context. The government agencies that had overseen both programs had it in the form that regulatory capture and the specific political economy of large defense contracting relationships had produced in the agencies nominally responsible for accountability in those domains. The civilization was, in this accounting, a civilization that had developed extraordinary sophistication in the management of the gap between what its institutions were and what they presented themselves as being a civilization whose most distinctive institutional achievement was the production of the specific sustained gap between surface and reality that the Vault program represents in its most fully realized expression. What the bombs did to this civilization is what the franchise has always presented with the specific ambivalence that the most honest post-apocalyptic visions maintain as simultaneously catastrophic and revelatory. As simultaneously, the worst thing that happened to the specific people who experienced it, and the specific event that removed the specific institutional infrastructure whose primary function had been the maintenance of the surfaces that had made the civilization's most consequential harms invisible to the people harmed by them. The bombs destroyed the Vault-Tec Corporation. They destroyed the government agencies that had funded and overseen and nominally regulated the Vault program. They destroyed the specific regulatory environment that had been specifically managed into the specific form that permitted the program to operate as it had operated. They destroyed, in other words, the specific institutional infrastructure whose primary function in relation to the Vault program had been the maintenance of the appearances that concealed the program's actual character. What they left behind was the program's actual products, the specific human consequences that the program's experimental designs had produced in the specific people they had been applied to, now existing in the post-institutional landscape of the wasteland, without the specific institutional framework that had constructed and maintained the context within which those consequences had been produced. The super mutants of the capital wasteland existed in the wasteland without Vault-Tec. The fractured communities produced by the social destruction of experimental protocols designed to fragment them existed in the wasteland without the institutional framework that had designed the fragmentation. The specific people who had survived the specific conditions of specific experimental vaults existed in the wasteland, carrying the specific inheritance of those conditions without the specific institution whose research agenda those conditions had served. The bombs had destroyed the institution. They had not destroyed the institutional legacy. The legacy was the wasteland, was the specific population and the specific communities and the specific biological transformations and the specific social formations that the program's experimental designs had produced across the 200 years of the program's operation, now constituting the specific human material from which whatever civilization emerged from the catastrophe would have to build. The Pip-Boy's smile is still on the vault doors. This is the franchise's most precise single image of the relationship between the Vault program's surface and its reality. The specific fact that the promotional logo of the program that had presented itself as protection for the people it had used as research subjects remains affixed to the sealed doors of the facilities that housed the research. 2 centuries after the civilization that had produced both the logo and the research had ceased to exist in any form, the smile had been designed to communicate care. The facility behind the door had been designed to conduct experiments on the people the smile was supposed to care for. The smile is still there. The door is still sealed. The specific people who trusted the smile and entered the facility are present in the wasteland in every form that the experimental designs produced them in the super mutants and the fractured communities and the specific social formations and the specific biological legacies that the experimental protocols generated across the full span of their operation. The smile has not changed in 200 years. The people it was produced to reassure have been transformed by the program that the smile was designed to conceal into the specific wasteland that anyone who has ever played a Fallout game has inhabited from the first moment of their engagement with the franchise. This is what the franchise has always been showing its audience. In every Pip-Boy image, and every Vault-Tec logo, and every cheerful pre-war promotional fragment preserved in the ruins of the civilization that produced them, the specific relationship between the institutional surface and the institutional reality that the surface had been designed to manage, now visible in the specific distance between the smile and what is behind the door that bears it. The honest accounting of what the Vault program was ultimately reveals about the franchise's foundational moral claim, the claim that the Great War was not a departure from the pre-war civilization's trajectory, but the logical terminal point is the accounting that the program's specific institutional character makes most directly available. The Great War did not happen because the pre-war civilization's institutions had failed to be what they claimed to be. It happened because they had succeeded, because the specific institutional logic that organized the civilization's most consequential actors had been pursued with sufficient consistency and sufficient sophistication, and sufficient freedom from the external accountability that might have interrupted its pursuit to reach the specific terminal point that the logic, pursued consistently enough and long enough, was always going to reach. The Vault program is the specific institution whose documentary record makes this argument most directly available for examination, because the program's full documented history provides the specific evidence of what the civilization's characteristic institutional logic actually produced when it was applied with maximum resources and maximum regulatory latitude to an objective of maximum scale. And because that evidence is the evidence of a program organized around the systematic betrayal of the specific population it had promised to protect. If the most ambitious civilian protection program in the pre-war civilization's history was actually a systematic research program on human subjects that used the trust of the people seeking its protection as the mechanism through which access to those people's bodies and lives was secured, then the civilization that produced this program was not a civilization that failed to live up to its values. It was a civilization whose values, examined at the level of what its most powerful institutions actually did, rather than at the level of what those institutions claimed to be doing, included the specific willingness to treat human beings as resources whose welfare was subordinate to the institutional interests of the actors holding power over them. The bombs were the specific endpoint of a trajectory that the Vault program illuminates more clearly than any other single element of the franchise's lore, the endpoint of a civilization that had organized its most consequential institutions around the production of surfaces and the management of the realities those surfaces concealed, and that had pursued that organizational logic with sufficient consistency that the specific catastrophe the logic's terminal expression produced had become, by the time it arrived, not simply possible, but comprehensible. What this accounting asks of the person willing to perform it is the specific form of attention that the franchise has always been asking its audience to bring to the specific world. It has constructed the attention that refuses the comfortable distance of fiction while inhabiting the specific forms of engagement that fiction makes available, that uses the specific horror of the Vault program's documented history, not as the subject of entertainment whose horror is pleasurable because it is safely fictional, but as the specific lens through which the institutional tendencies that the program represents in their most fully realized fictional form can be examined in the more constrained but no less consequential forms in which they appear in the real-world institutional landscape that the audience inhabits. The Vault program is not a realistic prediction of what real government programs do to real civilian populations. It is the specific fictional extrapolation of real institutional tendencies that real institutional histories document, pushed to the specific extreme that the fictional universe permits in order to make the tendencies visible in their clearest available form. The distance between the fictional extreme and the real-world institutional landscape is a real distance. It is not an infinite distance. The specific institutional tendencies that the Vault program represents in their most fully realized fictional form are tendencies whose real-world expressions are documented in the real-world histories of real institutional programs that operated with inadequate accountability and whose specific human consequences the documentary records of those programs preserve with the specific clinical language of institutional documentation that the Vault program's own terminal records so precisely replicate. The franchise is not warning its audience that Vault-Tec exists in the real world. It is asking its audience to understand that the specific institutional logic that Vault-Tec represents in its most fully realized fictional form has real-world expressions that deserve the specific quality of sustained, critical, genuinely attentive engagement that the franchise's examination of the fictional version models. Rest now, wanderer. The vault door stands in the darkness of the wasteland with the Pip-Boy's smile still affixed to it, the specific smile that was designed to communicate care for the people who trusted it. Standing over the specific facility that was designed to use the people who trusted it as the research material for a program whose existence they were never intended to know. The people inside the vaults were real. Their specific trust was real. The specific institutional design that converted their trust into the mechanism of their exploitation was real. Real in the specific, fictional sense of the franchise's carefully documented universe, and real in the specific, more general sense of representing institutional tendencies, whose expressions are not limited to the fictional universe in which the franchise examines them. The Vault program's documentary record is the franchise's most comprehensive single illustration of what institutional power does when it is organized around the management of appearances rather than the genuine service of the race. People, the appearances are designed to reassure of what happens to the specific human beings on the wrong side of the gap between the institutional surface and the institutional reality that the surface was built to conceal. Their names are mostly not preserved in the terminal records. The research categories they were assigned to are preserved. The experimental outcomes they represented are preserved. The specific people they were with, their specific photographs and their single bags and their specific goodbyes to the world outside the vault door are present in the record in the specific absence of the individual names and individual histories that would make them fully visible as the specific people they were, rather than as the subject population, whose presence in the specific experimental conditions the designs required. They deserve the specific quality of attention that the honest accounting requires. The door is sealed. The smile is on the door. Sleep now, gently, and carry forward the understanding that the most important questions any institutional framework can be asked are the questions about the specific people on the wrong side of the gap between what the institution presents itself as being and what it actually is, and that the asking of those questions, however uncomfortable and however costly to the specific comforts that institutional surfaces are designed to provide, is the specific form of attention that the specific people behind the surfaces have always deserved and have not always received. Sleep well.